A 43-year-old veteran Navy SEAL came home after 90 days in recovery, with only his German Shepherd K9 beside him. His family had taken the business, sold the house, and left him a ruined gas station nobody wanted. Then Flint became obsessed with one cracked spot beneath an old hydraulic lift. One hollow sound brought back his father's strange warning. Don't count the pumps. Count carefully. What lay beneath the floor would lead to a hidden bank box, 11 acres, and a fortune no one expected. But the real fight was about something deeper, whether a man's worst years should define his future. Tell us where you're watching from, and please like and subscribe to K9 Navy SEAL Stories. The road north from Duluth narrowed by degrees, as though civilization were quietly reconsidering how much of itself it wished to carry into the woods. By the time Cullen Wade Hartwell reached the outskirts of Pine Haven, the highway had become a two-lane ribbon between white pine, spruce, cedar, and early yellow birch. Sunlight flashed through the branches in broad, warm pieces. Beyond the trees, small lakes caught the late August sky and held it like polished blue metal. Cullen drove with both hands on the wheel. He was 43, 6 feet 1 inch tall, broad through the shoulders, and built with the dense, practical strength of a man who had spent nearly 2 decades training his body to function under exhaustion rather than display itself. His face was angular and weathered, with a defined jaw, moderately high cheekbones, a straight nose, and deep blue-gray eyes that rarely gave away more than he intended. Sun had roughened his skin over the years. Fine lines had settled around his eyes before their time. His dark brown hair was still cut short in the military style he had never bothered to abandon, though premature silver now marked both temples. Short natural stubble shadowed his jaw. He wore what had become his only dependable uniform outside the Navy. An old red and black flannel shirt with slightly frayed cuffs and collar, a light gray t-shirt underneath, faded dark blue jeans, worn brown leather work boots dusted from the road, and an old military watch on his left wrist. The watch still worked. Cullen was less certain about himself. 4 months sober. He had repeated the number so many times that it had stopped sounding like an achievement and started sounding like a temporary measurement. 4 months. 122 mornings in which he had woken up without having to reconstruct the previous night from broken pieces. 90 of those days had been spent inside a residential recovery program for veterans outside Duluth. The days before that had been detox. Fluorescent lights, trembling hands, sweat that smelled metallic, and hours in which 5 minutes had seemed more difficult than some operations overseas. Now there was no staff, no schedule taped to a hallway wall, no locked medicine cabinet, no one asking him at 7 every morning what he intended to do if he felt like drinking that afternoon. There was only the road, and Flint. The German Shepherd occupied most of the rear seat, although occupied was not quite the right word. Flint never sprawled carelessly. Even at rest, the 7-year-old K9 held himself with the compact alertness of a working dog who had spent too much of his life listening for changes in a room. He was a black and tan German Shepherd with a short, dense, healthy coat, a clear black saddle over his back, a dark muzzle, and warm tan coloring across his legs, lower chest, and the sides of his face. His body was muscular without being oversized, lean enough for speed, strong enough to stop a man if required. Both triangular ears stood naturally erect. His amber brown eyes were deep, intelligent, and almost unnervingly attentive. A simple coyote brown nylon working harness wrapped his chest, with a small faded K9 patch on each side. Flint had once worked in the same military world Cullen had, not as a pet, as a professional. When the dog was finally retired, Cullen had completed the adoption paperwork and brought him home. Somewhere along the way, their roles had reversed. Cullen had once been one of the men responsible for keeping Flint alive. Now Flint was often the reason Cullen remembered to keep himself alive. The dog lifted his head when Cullen turned onto the county road toward Pine Haven. "You remember this place?" Cullen asked, one ear angled toward him. "Yeah, me neither." It was not much of a joke, but dry humor was about as close as Cullen usually came to admitting he was nervous. His phone buzzed in the cup holder. A message from Warren. "Station, noon. We need to finish this." Cullen checked the dashboard clock. 11:41. He had been out of treatment less than 4 hours. Apparently his family had decided not to waste time pretending they missed him. Hartwell Family Filling Station sat on County Road 18, where the pavement bent toward the North Woods. It had once been the last reliable fuel stop before miles of forest roads, fishing access points, hunting cabins, and snowmobile trails. Cullen remembered summer mornings when pickup trucks had lined up too deep at the pumps, and his father had shouted prices through the open service bay doors, while country radio played badly through a speaker nailed over the parts shelf. Now the place looked as though the forest had begun reclaiming it politely. 2 old pumps stood beneath the weathered canopy, their metal housings faded and rusted around the bases. Grass pushed through cracks in the gravel and concrete. The rectangular office window had a long fracture across one corner. Above it, the hand-painted sign still read Hartwell Family Filling Station, although the H had faded badly and the red border had gone nearly brown. Behind the building, trees rose thick and green toward Foxglass Creek. Warren Hartwell stood beside a dark pickup with a folder tucked beneath one arm. At 58, Warren was a solidly built man, about 6 feet tall, broad through the torso but heavier around the stomach than Cullen remembered. His face was square, his jaw wide, his cheeks slightly full, and his thick eyebrows sat over brown-gray eyes that always seemed to be measuring the cost of whatever stood in front of him. His brown-gray hair was combed neatly to one side and had gone heavily silver at the temples. He was clean-shaven. He wore a dark denim button-down work shirt, brown-gray khaki pants, relatively clean brown work boots, a black leather belt, and a plain metal watch. Warren had spent most of his adult life believing problems were evidence that somebody had failed to plan properly. Years of cleaning up after other relatives, business debts, missed appointments, Ezra's drinking, Cullen's collapse after leaving the service, had turned that belief into something harder. Responsibility to Warren had slowly become ownership. If he was the one forced to carry the load, he believed he had earned the right to choose the direction. Lucas Hartwell leaned against the passenger side of Warren's truck. Cullen's older brother was 47, around 6 feet tall, strongly built but softer than Cullen through the shoulders and waist. He had the Hartwell jaw and straight nose, though his expression was less severe than Warren's. His short brown hair was threaded with gray, and a very short brown-gray stubble covered his lower face. His eyes were an uncertain mixture of blue-gray and brown. Lucas wore a dark tan work jacket over a charcoal Henley, medium blue jeans and brown work boots. He had always been the peacemaker of the family, which mostly meant he disliked conflict enough to stand beside whoever appeared strongest until the argument was over. He was not cruel. That sometimes made his silence worse. Flint jumped down from the truck. Lucas watched the dog, then Cullen. "Looks good," Lucas said. Cullen glanced at Flint. "He knows." Lucas almost smiled. Warren did not. "You're late." Cullen checked his old military watch, 11:58. Warren exhaled through his nose. The family reunion, apparently, was underway. He opened the folder. "The estate still has residual items to close. Trucking operations are being transferred according to the existing business arrangement. House already sold. Equipment inventories almost done." Cullen listened. Ezra Hartwell had died 14 months earlier from a stroke. There had been no long final decline, no hospital room in which everyone gathered around long enough to say the things families in movies always seemed capable of saying. Ezra had collapsed behind the counter inside this station. By the time anyone understood what was happening, the argument was already over. Cullen had been drinking heavily then. He had missed the funeral. That fact sat inside him differently now that he was sober. Alcohol had once blurred shame. Sobriety sharpened it. Warren continued. "Your father's will leave this property to you. Station parcel, building, fixtures remaining on site." He gestured toward the garage like a man presenting evidence of poor judgment. "You make that sound unfortunate," Cullen said. "It is unfortunate." Lucas shifted his weight. Warren went on. "County's been talking again about drainage work along Foxglass Creek. Culvert expansion, flood management, something like that. Nobody knows when. Meanwhile, this roof is going. Electrical's outdated. Pumps are dead. Structure may not pass inspection. So estate administration doesn't need another 6 months tied up because you want to play mechanic in a condemned building." Cullen looked at him. Warren's voice tightened. "Sign off on demolition if the county moves forward. We clear the structure, resolve the remaining frontage issues. Everybody moves on." "Everybody? You know what I mean." Cullen did. Everybody who already had something to move on with. Lucas had the trucking company. Warren had control of the estate process. Cullen had 4 months sober, a duffel bag, a retired K9, and a filling station Warren described like an infection. Cullen extended his hand. "Key." Warren stared at the open palm. "That's your answer? I didn't hear a question." "Cullen Key." For a moment, Warren's square jaw flexed. Then he reached into his pocket, pulled out a single old brass key, and dropped it into Cullen's hand. It landed cold against his skin. "Knock yourself out," Warren said. "Just don't expect the rest of us to pay when the place falls on you." Cullen closed his fingers around the key. Wouldn't dream of ruining the family tradition. Lucas looked down, hiding another almost smile. Warren did not find it funny. Inside, the station smelled of mildew, old gasoline, dust, and motor oil soaked so deeply into concrete that no amount of cleaning would ever completely remove it. Cullen stood just past the threshold. Flint entered beside him and immediately began surveying the room with quiet professional attention. The front office was nearly bare. That was not technically theft. As personal representative, Warren had authority to inventory estate property, and most of the more valuable tools had belonged to the business rather than the real estate itself. Compressors, diagnostic equipment, specialty tools, and several cabinets had already been moved to the trucking yard. The explanation was legal. The emptiness still felt personal. A calendar hung crooked behind the counter, open to the month Ezra died. A pale rectangle showed where the cash register had sat for decades. The wooden counter had been worn smooth beneath it. On a shelf sat a chipped enamel mug, dark blue around the rim. Cullen recognized it immediately. His father had drunk coffee from that mug so strong it could probably have removed paint. He reached toward it, then stopped. For reasons he could not explain, touching it felt harder than opening the front door had. Flint moved through the office, nose working lightly. Cullen walked into the first service bay, empty, oil stain under the old lift, dusty windows, nothing. The second bay had taken more water damage. A brown tide line climbed several inches along one wall. The concrete near the floor drain had buckled slightly. Cullen looked toward the rear window where sunlight fell in narrow gold rectangles, and memory came back, not gently. 4 years earlier, Ezra had driven 3 hours to a treatment center where Cullen had checked himself in for the first time. It was the first program, one Cullen left after 11 days. Ezra Hartwell had been 65 then, about 5 feet 10, once broad and powerful but already beginning to thin with age. He had a long, weathered face, a firm jaw softer than Cullen's, a large straight nose, low cheekbones, and light blue-gray eyes. His brown hair had gone mostly gray and was thinning in front. A short salt and pepper beard covered his chin and jaw. He had worn the same kind of clothes almost every working day, a faded navy work shirt with the sleeves rolled to his forearms, an off-white t-shirt, charcoal work pants, old brown boots, dark leather belt, and a shop rag tucked into his back pocket. His hands had always looked too large for paperwork and perfectly sized for broken machinery. Ezra could rebuild a carburetor patiently for 3 hours and lose his temper in 3 minutes, trying to explain that he loved somebody. That afternoon outside the treatment center, he had been drinking. Cullen could smell it before Ezra reached him. "You drove here like this?" Cullen had asked. Ezra shoved both hands into his pockets. "I'm standing here, ain't I? That wasn't the question. Never is with you." They had stood beneath a cold gray sky, father and son, each furious because the other's failures looked too familiar. Cullen had expected an apology. Ezra had expected gratitude for showing up. Neither gave what the other wanted. Then, just before leaving, Ezra said something strange. "I didn't leave you the pumps, Cullen." Cullen had stared at him. "What? The pumps ain't the thing. You're drunk." Ezra's eyes had dropped toward the pavement. "I left you. What's underneath them?" Cullen had felt anger rise hot through the exhaustion. "There is nothing underneath them." Ezra looked up again. For one brief second, despite the alcohol, his expression had been painfully clear. Then count carefully. Cullen had told him to go home. He had not understood that those would be the last words from his father he would ever remember clearly. A metallic click pulled Cullen out of the memory. Flint stood in the second bay beside the hydraulic lift. The German shepherd's ears had angled forward. His body was not tense in the way it became when he sensed a person nearby. It was curiosity, focused curiosity. Flint. The dog glanced at Cullen but did not move. He lowered his muzzle to the concrete near one corner of the lift, sniffed, moved 6 inches, came back. "Leave it." Flint stepped away immediately, then stopped, turned, and returned to the same place. Cullen watched him. The old operational part of his mind woke quietly, not because the dog had found treasure, because Flint almost never repeated an alert without a stimulus. Cullen crouched beside him. There was a thin seam between the lift base and the concrete. Damp air could have moved through gravel below. A mouse could have nested somewhere under the slab. The dog might simply have picked up something living. Still, Cullen ran 2 fingers across the concrete. One section felt different, smoother, slightly darker, patched. He leaned closer. The rear corner of the lift base did not sit flush. Half an inch, maybe less. That should have bothered Ezra. His father had been the kind of mechanic who would spend 20 minutes correcting a bracket nobody else would ever see, because he knew it was crooked. Cullen stood slowly. Flint remained beside the seam, And then, without warning, the dog stopped sniffing and looked directly up at him. Not toward the door, not toward the woods. At Cullen. The stare lasted only a few seconds, but something about it tightened the space inside Cullen's chest. 4 years earlier, a drunk old mechanic had stood outside a treatment center and told his son not to count the pumps. Now the one creature Cullen trusted without qualification had refused twice to leave the ground beneath one. Cullen almost laughed at himself. Dogs followed scent. Dead men did not send messages through concrete. He knew that. He believed that. Yet when Flint finally stepped away, Cullen did not. For the rest of the afternoon, he found excuses to remain in the second bay. He checked the drain, inspected wall damage, tried one overhead light and discovered it flickered. Then he came back to the lift again and again. At sunset, he found a long screwdriver in a drawer everyone else had overlooked. Cullen crouched and tapped the handle against the floor. Solid. He moved 6 inches. Solid. Another 6. Solid. Then he struck the patched area near Flint's seam. The sound changed, not dramatically, just enough. A dry, hollow knock. Cullen struck it again. Hollow. Flint's ears rose. "Well," Cullen whispered. The dog looked at him. "That's inconvenient." Cullen could have driven into town and paid for a motel. He did not, partly because money was tight, mostly because leaving felt too much like surrendering something he had not yet decided he wanted. There was a small room behind the office where Ezra sometimes slept during winter storms rather than risk driving home. A narrow cot remained against the wall. Cullen found an old wool blanket in a cabinet and shook the dust from it outside. He ate a convenience store sandwich for dinner. Flint ate from the travel bowl beside the door. Night settled differently in Pine Haven than in Duluth. No traffic hum, no neighboring television through drywall. Only crickets, creek water somewhere beyond the trees, an occasional truck passing County Road 18, and the old building adjusting to the cold after sunset. Cullen lay awake, staring at the ceiling. His mind kept returning to 3 things: the hollow sound, Flint's refusal to leave it, Ezra's voice, count carefully, at some point exhaustion 1. Then the dream came. It began in heat, dust, a narrow alley, radio static, a door Cullen knew he should not open but opened anyway. Then the sound changed, not gunfire, metal striking concrete. Again. Cullen woke sitting upright. For several seconds he did not know where he was. His breath came too fast. Heart hammering. The darkness around him had edges. The old part of his brain started assigning threats. Door, window, corner, exit. Then Flint rose from the floor. The dog did not jump onto him or lick his face. He simply came close and pressed his shoulder against Cullen's leg. Cullen put one hand on the thick fur at Flint's neck. Warm, real. Here, he forced himself to count. 4 seconds in. Hold. 4 out. Again, the room returned piece by piece. Cot, wall, old station, Minnesota, not overseas. Flint remained in place until Cullen's hand stopped trembling. "Good boy," Cullen whispered. The German shepherd lowered himself beside the cot again. Cullen did not go back to sleep. He sat with his back against the wall until the window began turning gray. For years he had thought strength meant controlling every reaction before anyone could see it. Treatment had taught him something more humiliating and more useful. Sometimes strength meant noticing the reaction before it decided what happened next. Sometimes it meant putting your hand on a dog and admitting you needed something steady. At dawn, Cullen made coffee in an old machine that somehow still worked. It was terrible. For the first time in 14 months, that made him think of Ezra without immediately thinking of the funeral he had missed. His father had made terrible coffee too. Cullen stood in the office doorway with the mug warming his hands. Morning sunlight entered the garage through dusty windows. Flint walked into the second bay. He passed the hydraulic lift without stopping this time. Cullen watched him. "Really?" Flint kept walking. "Now you're done with it?" One ear turned back. Cullen shook his head. Very professional. He set down the coffee. Outside, the forest had brightened completely. The tops of the birches moved gently in the breeze. Somewhere beyond them, Foxglass Creek flashed between cedar trunks. The station still looked worthless. 2 dead pumps, a cracked window, a tired roof, an empty garage. Exactly the kind of thing Warren would leave to the brother and son nobody expected much from. Cullen went to the back of his Ford. He opened the tool compartment. There was no grand revelation waiting inside. Only gloves, a flashlight, a basic socket set, and an old crowbar. He picked up the crowbar. Its weight felt ordinary. That helped. Cullen walked back toward the garage. Flint followed several steps behind. At the entrance to the second bay, Cullen stopped and looked once more at the uneven lift base and the patch of concrete beneath it. For 4 years, he had believed Ezra's words were nothing more than the confused fragments of a drunk man trying to leave an impression before walking away. For 14 months, he had believed there would never be another chance to ask what those words meant. Now a hollow sound waited beneath the floor. Cullen tightened his hand around the crowbar. For the first time, he allowed himself to consider a possibility he would have dismissed the day before. Maybe Ezra Hartwell had known exactly what he was saying, and maybe the thing everyone else had decided was worthless had not yet given up its whole story. Cullen began with the electricity. Before touching the damaged section of floor, he went to the rusted breaker panel in the rear utility room and killed power to the second service bay. He checked the lift controls twice, then followed the hydraulic lines by flashlight until he was satisfied there was no stored pressure likely to turn an old machine into a 3,000-pound surprise. It was not glamorous work. Most things that kept people alive were not. He photographed the lift base from 4 angles with his phone, measured the visible patch line, and used a carpenter's pencil from an abandoned drawer to mark the area he intended to open. Years earlier, younger men had sometimes mistaken Cullen's calm for slowness. The Navy had taught him otherwise. Fast was useful only after careful had already done its job. Flint lay several yards away near the open service bay door, forelegs stretched in front of him, coyote brown harness catching strips of morning light. The German shepherd watched Cullen without trying to approach the work area. Every few minutes, one ear rotated toward a passing truck or a bird moving in the rafters, but his amber eyes kept returning to Cullen. "Supervisor," Cullen muttered. Flint blinked. Very demanding position. Cullen put on gloves and safety glasses. The first 20 minutes produced nothing except dust. The patched concrete was harder than it looked, and more uneven than a professional repair should have been. Cullen worked along one edge instead of driving the pry bar downward blindly. Small chips broke loose first. Then a fist-sized section came free. Gray gravel appeared beneath it. Cullen stopped. He brushed away dust with the side of his glove and widened the opening a few inches at a time. The gravel bed was unusually clean, no broken chunks of old slab, no random construction debris. Someone had placed it deliberately. That realization changed the feeling in the bay. Until then, Cullen had been investigating a flaw in an old floor. Now he was following a decision. He worked more slowly. After nearly an hour, the end of the pry bar struck something that did not sound like stone, metal. Cullen froze. Flint lifted his head. Cullen removed another narrow section of concrete and pushed gravel aside with his gloved fingers. A flat gray surface appeared underneath. Steel, not a pipe, not reinforcement mesh, a plate. He cleared more. The metal continued beneath the slab in a clean rectangular line. "Dad," Cullen said quietly. The word escaped before he meant to speak it. Flint stood but remained where he was. Cullen sat back on his heels. For several seconds he did nothing. He had spent years in places where finding an unexpected metal object in the ground meant backing away, marking coordinates, and letting someone with better equipment decide whether everybody got to keep their hands. Here, in an abandoned filling station in northern Minnesota, instinct still whispered the same warning. So Cullen obeyed the instinct. He did not immediately pry at the steel. He inspected. There were no wires, no obvious electrical connection, no smell of fuel, no pressure line disappearing beneath it. He widened the concrete opening enough to expose one full corner. What emerged was not merely a plate. It was the lid of a rectangular steel box set into the gravel beneath the hydraulic lift. Every visible seam had been welded shut. No hinge, no latch, no padlock. Whoever had put it there had not intended ordinary access. Cullen swept dust away from one of the seams. Then he saw the weld termination. 2 small circular touches of metal, close together at the end of the bead. His stomach tightened. Ezra Hartwell had done that all his life. It was not a proper signature. No welding manual recommended it. Earl Pritchard had once mocked him for it, according to a story Cullen had heard at least 50 times as a boy. Ezra claimed the 2 dots helped him remember which direction he had run the bead. Nobody believed him. He simply liked doing it. Cullen had watched those paired marks appear on muffler brackets, snowplow mounts, cracked mower decks, trailer hitches, and once on a metal stool Ezra repaired for a woman from the church even though she had offered to buy a new one. 2 little dots, meaningless unless you knew the hands that made them. Cullen reached down and touched the cooled steel with 2 fingers. 14 months dead, and somehow Ezra's hands were suddenly in the room. That bothered Cullen more than he expected. He stood too quickly and had to steady himself against the lift post. Flint came halfway toward him. "I'm fine." The dog stopped. Cullen stared at the welded box again. "No," he corrected. That was a lie. Flint sat. Cullen almost smiled. There were some audiences a man could not fool. He did not own a cutting tool capable of opening the box cleanly, and the last thing he wanted was to attack it with brute force and destroy whatever might be inside. He knew exactly one man who would recognize Ezra's weld as quickly as he had. Earl Pritchard lived 3 streets behind the old Lutheran church in a narrow single-story house with a detached workshop that was nearly as large as the house itself. Cullen had not seen him in years. When Earl opened the front door, time seemed to have taken material away without softening any of the edges. He was 71, about 5'9", thin but still rope-strong through the forearms and shoulders. Age had bent him slightly forward. His face was narrow and heavily lined, with a small hard jaw, a slightly hooked nose, and pale blue eyes that remained sharp beneath wiry gray-white eyebrows. His hair was short, white-gray, and thinning at the crown. A faint white stubble covered his chin. He wore Old Navy mechanics coveralls over a light gray thermal shirt. Dark brown-black work boots showed years of polish, oil, and neglect in equal measure. A dark wooden cane leaned against the wall behind him. Both hands were enlarged at the knuckles by arthritis. Those hands had spent almost 20 years beside Ezra's. Earl looked at Cullen first, then Flint, then back at Cullen. "You got old." Cullen nodded. "You got rude. That happened before you left." Earl's mouth twitched. It was the closest thing he usually offered to a greeting. Earl had always been dry, patient, and almost impossible to impress. He treated everyone, from teenagers buying their first car to county commissioners driving expensive trucks, with the same blunt economy. Years ago, he had lost a son after a long estrangement shaped by addiction and anger, though Cullen knew only fragments of that history. The loss had left Earl quieter, not kinder exactly, but more careful about which judgments he allowed himself to make out loud. His pale eyes moved over Cullen again. 4 months? Cullen was surprised. "Who told you? Small town. 4 months. Earl nodded once. No congratulations, no suspicion, just acceptance. Cullen preferred that. "I found something at the station." Earl's expression did not change. "Where?" "Bay 2. A pause. Very small. But Cullen saw it. Under the lift. Earl's left hand tightened around the edge of the door. "Not much, enough." Cullen felt the old alertness come alive behind his ribs. "You know something." Earl looked past him toward the street. "No." That wasn't convincing. Never cared much for convincing people. "Earl." The older man sighed. "Show me." He reached for the cane. Earl's truck smelled faintly of machine oil, coffee, and cigarettes he had quit more than a decade earlier. He asked no questions during the drive. That told Cullen more than questions would have. When they entered the second service bay, Earl walked directly toward the exposed steel without needing Cullen to point. He stopped over it. His face changed. Not shock, recognition. Earl lowered himself carefully with the help of the cane, knees cracking audibly, then touched the welded seam. His thumb moved toward the paired dots. "Stubborn bastard," he murmured. "You recognize it." "I recognize his welding." "So did I." Earl sat back. Spring of 2015. Cullen waited. "Your dad poured this section himself. Came in on a Saturday when the station was closed. Told me the lift base had shifted and he wanted to reset part of the slab." "Was that true?" "Lift worked fine Friday." Cullen looked at the box. "You asked him?" "Course I asked him." "What did he say?" "Said he had it handled." "That was it?" "That was Ezra." Earl pushed himself upright again. "He wouldn't let me help. Wouldn't even let me stay. I figured he was doing something stupid." Cullen glanced down. "Looks like you were right." "Not necessarily." The answer came too quickly. Cullen turned toward him. Earl's eyes remained on the box. That was the moment the room shifted again. Not because of the steel, because Earl was holding something back. A man who had worked beside Ezra for almost 20 years had just seen a secret buried under concrete, and instead of asking what it was, he looked as though a clock had finally reached a time he had been expecting. For the first time, Cullen wondered whether the secret beneath the lift had ever really been hidden from everyone. Maybe it had only been hidden from him. Flint walked to Earl's side and sniffed the old man's coveralls. Earl glanced down. "Still nosy?" Flint looked up at him. "He gets that from Cullen." "Traitor," Cullen said. Earl's mouth twitched again, but the humor vanished quickly. "I've got a grinder at home." Cullen studied him. "You know what's inside?" "No." "You know why it's there?" "No." "Then what do you know?" Earl met Cullen's eyes. "Enough to tell you not to open it with a sledgehammer." It was not an answer, but it was something. They retrieved Earl's grinder, a heavy old tool kept in a red plastic case, along with several cutting discs. Back at the station, Earl insisted on doing the first seam himself. His hands shook slightly from arthritis until the grinder powered on. Then muscle memory took over. Sparks scattered across the concrete in brief orange arcs. Flint retreated toward the office doorway without being told. Cullen knelt beside Earl, keeping the work light steady and watching the cut depth. "Not too deep," Earl said. "I know." Then quit breathing like you're waiting for it to explode. I'm not. You are, Cullen exhaled. Better? No. 40 minutes later, 3 sides of the top seam had been cut. Earl shut off the grinder. Silence rushed back into the bay. Cullen used a flat pry tool to lift one corner. The steel resisted, then released with a metallic groan. A smell of dry dust and old paper drifted upward. Inside the larger steel container sat a smaller lockbox wrapped in brittle plastic. The lockbox was black once, though years underground had dulled it to charcoal gray. One corner had been welded to a short steel rod descending through the bottom of the larger container into the gravel beneath. Earl touched the rod. He anchored it, so nobody could carry the whole thing out. Your father distrusted shortcuts. Cullen reached inside and lifted the lockbox as far as the anchor allowed. Light. Something small shifted inside. Metal tapping metal. His heart accelerated. He disliked that reaction. Hope was dangerous when it arrived before information. He had spent enough years learning what happened when a man turned possibility into certainty, because certainty felt better. The box had a simple key lock. No combination. No key attached. Earl searched the larger container while Cullen examined the plastic wrapping. Nothing, no envelope, no note, no hidden pocket. Did Dad ever give you a key? Cullen asked. No, you sure? Earl gave him a look. Arthritis didn't eat my memory. They spent the next hour searching the station office. Cullen went drawer by drawer instead of tearing through everything. Old tax receipts, part invoices, expired registration forms, a coffee tin of screws, 2 spark plugs in packaging so old the cardboard had yellowed, a stack of customer IOUs from years ago, many marked P'd in Ezra's block handwriting even when Cullen suspected they never had been. Earl sat in the old office chair while Cullen worked, resting his hands between attempts to help. Flint lay near the front door. The final drawer in Ezra's desk refused to open more than 4 inches. Cullen pulled again. It jammed at the left corner. A memory surfaced. Not of anything important, just Ezra swearing at the same drawer when Cullen was perhaps 12 years old. He never fixed this thing, Cullen muttered. Earl snorted. Mechanics. Cullen removed the drawer from its rails. A strip of yellowed tape clung to the underside of the wooden frame. Beneath it was a small brass key. Cullen held it up. Earl said nothing. The key fit the lockbox. Cullen turned it. A quiet click. For some reason, that sound felt louder than the grinder had. He opened the lid. No cash, no jewelry, no stock certificates. 2 objects rested inside. The first was another key, larger, newer, stamped with 4 numbers, 4471. The second was a folded fragment of heavy paper. Cullen opened it carefully. It was part of a land survey. One boundary line cut diagonally across the fragment. A narrow blue marking indicated water, likely a creek. Near the torn edge, only the ending of a word remained visible. Akers Cullen stared at the 2 items. After everything, the concrete welding anchored lockbox. He had expected something that explained itself. Instead, he had a numbered key and less than half a map. That's it, he said. Earl took the larger key. His pale eyes narrowed. Safe deposit key. You recognize the style? Franklin first used these for years. Cullen looked again at the survey fragment. The disappointment passed quickly, replaced by a different unease. Ezra had buried directions to something rather than the thing itself. Cullen murmured the words that had been following him for 4 years. Count carefully. Earl went completely still. Cullen noticed immediately, not the kind of stillness produced by surprise. The kind produced by recognition. He turned. What? Earl did not answer. Earl. The older man lowered the safe deposit key to the desk. When did he say that to you? Cullen's chest tightened. You've heard it before. Earl looked older suddenly, not weaker. Just tired in a way Cullen had not seen when he opened the front door. About 4 years ago, Earl said. Your dad came into the shop after hours. Drunk? No. The answer mattered. He was sober, as I am right now. Earl rubbed one arthritic thumb over the other knuckles. He told me he'd put something away for you. Said I was not to touch it, not to tell Warren, not to tell Lucas, not to call you after he died. Cullen felt anger rise before he understood exactly who it belonged to. What was I supposed to do? Guess? He said if you ever came back and started asking questions about the lift, then I could help. That's insane. Maybe. He made you wait for me to solve some damn puzzle? Earl's expression hardened. He made me wait until you were the one looking. Cullen laughed once without humor. So that's the standard? I prove I'm good enough first? No. That's what it sounds like. No, Cullen. Earl leaned forward. His voice remained quiet. Your father did not wait for you to become worthy of anything. The anger in Cullen slowed. Earl continued. He waited because 4 years ago, if Ezra had handed you whatever that key leads to, what would you have done? Cullen looked away. Don't. You asked. I didn't ask that. No. But that's the question underneath the one you did ask. Cullen stared through the cracked office window toward the pumps. He knew that was the worst part. 4 years earlier, money would not have saved him. Money would have accelerated him. Paid for better rooms, longer disappearances, more efficient ways to ruin himself. Earl's voice softened only slightly. Ezra wasn't waiting for you to deserve what he left. He was waiting for you to survive long enough to receive it. Cullen swallowed. Flint rose from the doorway and crossed the office. The German shepherd stopped beside Cullen's chair and rested his muzzle briefly against Cullen's knee. Cullen put one hand on the dog's head. No one spoke for a while. Eventually, Cullen picked up key 4471. Franklin first? Most likely. I'll call. Earl nodded. The survey fragment remained between them. A torn boundary, a piece of water. Half a word, enough to promise meaning, not enough to give it. Cullen contacted Franklin First Credit Union shortly before closing. The process was slower than he wanted and more formal than he expected. He provided Ezra's full legal name, date of death, his own identity, and the safe deposit box number stamped on the key. The credit union confirmed box 4471 remained active in Ezra Hartwell's name. That was the good news. The rest arrived by secure email the following morning. Because Ezra's estate had not been fully closed, access to previously unreported property required verification through the estate process. Warren Hartwell, as the court-recognized personal representative, had been notified that a new potential estate asset had surfaced. Before Cullen could complete the access request, Franklin First received a written objection from Warren. The objection did not accuse Cullen of anything. That would have been easier. Instead, Warren used careful administrative language. He requested that the contents of box 4471 be treated as potentially uninventoried estate property until legal authority to inspect or release them was confirmed. The credit union therefore suspended access temporarily. Cullen read the notice twice, then a third time. He did not throw the phone, did not call Warren, did not drive to the trucking yard. 4 months earlier, he might have done all three in that order. Instead, he printed the notice using the station's ancient office printer, which complained loudly but eventually produced 2 crooked pages. Earl was sitting at the counter with coffee. Cullen slid the notice toward him. He blocked it. Earl read without reacting. Legally? Looks that way. Then don't give him the satisfaction of acting illegally. Cullen leaned against the counter. He called this place worthless. Maybe he thinks it is. He knows about the box now. So he moved fast. Earl folded the paper once. Cullen, there's a difference between knowing what's behind a locked door and being afraid somebody else will open it first. Cullen looked toward the second bay. The cut-open steel container remained beneath the lift, partly covered now to keep dust out. Key 4471 rested in his pocket. The torn survey fragment was locked in the office desk. Nothing had become clearer, and yet Warren's objection had changed the shape of the mystery. Cullen had spent most of his life learning to recognize fear when people disguised it as authority. Warren Hartwell had just used official paperwork, estate procedure, and a carefully worded objection to put a locked door between Cullen and whatever Ezra had left behind. Maybe Warren knew nothing. Maybe that was the point. A man did not have to know what he was protecting himself from to be frightened of it. Outside, wind moved through the birches behind the station. Flint stood at the open office door, ears forward, watching the tree line. Cullen touched the safe deposit key through the fabric of his jeans. For the moment, the path stopped at a bank vault he could not enter. But for the first time since returning to Pine Haven, Cullen knew one thing with certainty. The filling station had never been the whole inheritance, and somewhere beyond key 4471, Ezra Hartwell had left the rest of the sentence unfinished. For the next 2 days, Cullen turned the back office of Hartwell Family Filling Station into something it had never been before, a command post without a war. He cleared one half of Ezra's old desk and built 3 stacks. Noun, unconfirmed, assumption. The labels were written in black marker on strips of masking tape. It was a habit left over from another life. Cullen had learned long ago that uncertainty became dangerous when people began treating what they feared as though it were the same thing as what they knew. Memory could lie. Anger could lie faster. A good timeline usually could not. On the noun side sat the county parcel information he already had for the filling station estate correspondence. Ezra's old ledgers, photographs of the service bay, and copies of documents Warren had provided during the original probate process. The middle stack held questions. Why had Ezra buried instructions instead of simply writing them into the will? Why a fragment of a survey? Why had Warren reacted so quickly when a previously unknown bank box surfaced? And why had Ezra been so careful to separate one clue from another? The assumption stack was the smallest. Cullen kept it that way deliberately. Flint spent most of those hours beneath the desk. The 7-year-old German Shepherd would stretch out on the cool linoleum, black saddle rising and falling with slow breaths, amber-brown eyes opening whenever Cullen shifted too suddenly in his chair. His coyote-brown working harness remained on during the day, though Cullen loosened it slightly when they were inside for hours. Sometimes Flint watched the door, sometimes he watched Cullen. The distinction was becoming important. By noon on the second day, Cullen had read enough fuel invoices to know what regular gasoline had cost in Pinehaven during years he could barely remember living through. He had also discovered that Ezra saved everything. Receipts for alternators, handwritten mileage logs, copies of county tax notices, a note from 2009 reminding himself to buy Earl better coffee because the old bastard complains louder every winter. Cullen stared at that one longer than necessary. The handwriting made his father briefly alive in a way photographs never managed. There was irritation in the slant, humor in the words, a life taking up almost no space on paper. Then the tenderness vanished and frustration came back. He closed the ledger harder than he meant to. Flint raised his head. I know. The dog kept watching. I said I know. Flint blinked. Cullen leaned back. His lower back ached from sitting. His eyes burned from dust and small print. More than that, he hated the feeling of being led by a dead man who had apparently decided direct communication was for less complicated families. He stood. Walk. Flint was on his feet before the word ended. The land behind the station dropped gently toward Foxglass Creek. Late summer light poured through birch leaves that had only begun to yellow at the edges. White pine rose above younger spruce, and cedar crowded the low, wetter ground near the creek. Ferns covered the shaded slopes in broad green fans. The forest was bright enough that Cullen could see deep between the trunks instead of feeling enclosed by them. Flint moved 20 feet ahead, then checked back. Not because he needed permission, because he always tracked Cullen's position. They followed an old maintenance path barely visible beneath grass and pine needles. In places, Cullen found rusted sections of wire fence, probably decades old, half swallowed by roots and moss. Foxglass Creek appeared gradually through the cedar. The water was narrow here, perhaps 15 feet across, clear enough for Cullen to see stone through the current. Alder leaned over the banks. Sunlight flashed on the moving surface. Cullen stopped beside an old pine. His father had taken him fishing somewhere along this creek when he was 9 or 10. Ezra had spent most of the morning complaining that Cullen stepped too loudly. Then Ezra had stepped into a hole and gone thigh-deep into freezing water. Cullen had laughed so hard he dropped the bait bucket. Ezra had been furious for approximately 40 seconds. Then he laughed too. It was strange which memories survived. Not the important conversations, not the birthdays. A grown man standing in a creek, wet to the waist and cursing a trout. Cullen rubbed a thumb against the edge of his military watch. 4 months sober had taught him that grief was not a clean emotion. It did not arrive separately from anger. Sometimes love made the anger worse. Flint stepped into the shallows and drank. Don't get sentimental, Cullen told him. The dog kept drinking. You never even met him when he could move fast. Flint lifted his head, water running from his muzzle. Cullen looked toward the opposite bank. No sign, no hidden marker, no sudden answer. Good. Part of him had begun to distrust convenient discoveries. They walked another half-mile before turning back. The purpose of the walk had not been to find anything. It had been to get Cullen out of the room before impatience convinced him to make bad decisions. That alone made it useful. When they returned, the office felt smaller, but his thoughts did not. Cullen sat again and opened the ledger he had slammed shut. This time he examined the binding rather than the pages. Something cream-colored showed between the cardboard spine and the rear cover. He slid a fingernail beneath it. A business card came loose. The front read, Graham Ostrander, licensed land surveyor, boundary, topographic and rural parcels, surveys a Grand Marais. Telephone number was printed beneath. The card was old enough that the corners had softened. Cullen turned it over. Ezra's handwriting covered the back. Keep what you have. Don't file the revised copy yet. Cullen read it twice. Flint had settled beneath the desk again. Cullen looked down at him. This one was actually in a book. The German Shepherd thumped his tail once against the floor. Try not to take it personally. Graham Ostrander answered on the 5th ring. His voice sounded older but not frail. Ostrander, my name is Cullen Hartwell. Silence. Then, Ezra's boy, not a question. Cullen sat straighter. You remember him? I remember people who argue with survey monuments. That sounds like him. It was. Another pause. What did you find? The wording caught Cullen. Not what do you need, what did you find? I found your card. That all? No. Cullen gave him only enough. A fragment of a survey, a creek line, a partial word. Ostrander listened without interrupting. When Cullen finished, the older man said, "Come up here. Today? You waited 14 months. Another 2 hours won't hurt you." The line went dead. Cullen stared at the phone. Flint raised one ear. Apparently Dad collected difficult old men. Ostrander's office sat behind a weathered cedar house outside Grand Marais, in a converted 2-car garage, whose windows were crowded with rolled maps, drafting tubes and surveying equipment. Graham Ostrander was 66 years old and about 5 feet 10, with a lean, narrow frame that suggested decades of walking property lines in weather less forgiving than today's. His face was long, cheekbones high, nose narrow, mouth thin. Fine wrinkles radiated from pale blue eyes that seemed to inspect people the same way he inspected boundary descriptions. Carefully, without assuming more than the evidence allowed. His silver-gray hair was cut short and combed neatly back. He was clean-shaven. He wore a light khaki long-sleeved field shirt, gray olive outdoor trousers, a brown leather belt, and brown hiking boots scarred by actual terrain rather than fashion. A pair of thin reading glasses rode in his shirt pocket. Ostrander had the temperament of a man who disliked exaggeration, because exaggeration eventually became somebody else's property dispute. He answered questions precisely and corrected vague language almost as a reflex. Flint remained beside Cullen's left leg. Ostrander looked at the dog. Working? Retired. Looks unconvinced. He has opinions. Most professionals do. Cullen decided he liked him. Ostrander turned and walked into the office. Maps covered nearly every wall, township plats, creek corridors, forest parcels, old aerial photographs. A drafting table occupied the center of the room beneath a broad fluorescent fixture. Without asking Cullen to sit, Ostrander opened a metal filing cabinet and removed a thick folder labeled Hartwell, Ezra. Foxglass. Cullen felt his pulse change. "You kept that? I keep everything. You sound like my father." He owed me $70 for 3 months because he kept forgetting the final invoice. Then maybe not everything. Ostrander almost smiled. He placed a large folded survey on the drafting table and opened it. Cullen took the fragment from a protective envelope. Ostrander did not touch it at first. Put it there. Cullen aligned the torn paper with the lower right edge of the full survey. The fibers matched. So did the Blue Creek line. The missing word became complete. 11.0 acres. Cullen looked at it without speaking. Ostrander pointed to a heavy boundary. "This is not the filling station parcel." He moved his finger west. "This is." 2 separate shapes, 2 parcel numbers. One held the station building, service bays, pumps, and roadside frontage. The second sat directly behind it, broader and irregular, extending along Foxglass Creek. "Parcel A," Cullen said, "if you want to call it that. And this? Separate tract, 11 acres, platted independently. When? Original separation was recorded in 1994. Owner? Ostrander looked at him. Ezra Hartwell. Personally? Yes. Not Hartwell Trucking? No. Not the filling station business? No. Ostrander tapped the parcel number. Different legal description. Different tax account. Different chain of title. For several seconds, Cullen heard only the quiet hum of fluorescent lights. 11 acres. The number itself was not enormous. Northern Minnesota had parcels 100 times that size. But the distinction mattered. Ezra had kept this land outside the family company. Outside the asset Cullen had always thought of as the station. A separate piece. A separate decision. Cullen's eyes moved to the creek line. Why survey it again? Ostrander folded his arms. County planning. He pulled another map from the folder. This one showed a proposed corridor shaded along Foxglass Creek. About 11 years ago, there was renewed discussion of drainage expansion through this watershed. Spring runoff has been getting harder on the culverts. County engineers studied widening 2 crossings, creating a permanent maintenance corridor and securing temporary construction access. Cullen traced the line. It crosses this parcel, almost exactly where they'd want it. How much land? The easement footprint isn't the same thing as buying all 11 acres. I understand. Ostrander studied him for half a second, perhaps deciding whether he did, then nodded. The value comes from several pieces: permanent drainage rights, creek frontage, construction staging access, future maintenance access, reduced flexibility on the remaining parcel, potential restoration requirements. So what's it worth? I don't value property. You have an estimate. I have seen preliminary county appraisal material connected to the current project. Current? Ostrander pulled his glasses from the pocket. The project came back. He unfolded a recent planning sheet. The date was less than 2 months old. Funding moved forward this year. Cullen's attention sharpened. How much? Ostrander took his time. Preliminary compensation for an easement package on a parcel like this, with this frontage and access impact, would probably land somewhere around $340,000. Cullen said nothing. Ostrander corrected immediately, approximately $340,000, approximately, for 11 acres of woods. No, the surveyor's voice sharpened. For rights the county needs across 11 acres of woods. That distinction mattered to him. It also made the number believable. Cullen rested both hands on the edge of the drafting table. 340,000. 4 months earlier, he had been counting quarters at a vending machine because the treatment center's card reader was broken. He almost laughed at the distance between those two facts. But another thought arrived first. Warren could know this parcel exists. Ostrander removed his glasses. Anyone willing to pull the tax record could know it exists. He's personal representative. Then I'd assume he has access to estate records. So it was never secret. The land? No. Ostrander pointed to the torn survey fragment. This is something else. Cullen looked at him. What? Your father never asked me to hide ownership. He asked me to hold the revised survey. Why, he didn't say. Did he tell you who he intended the parcel to go to? Ostrander shook his head. No. The answer disappointed Cullen. Then Ostrander added, but he was very specific about keeping it out of Hartwell Trucking's books. That landed harder. Why? He said his father had given him this parcel outright. No business partners, no brothers, no strings. Ostrander's pale eyes rested on Cullen, and he intended to keep it that way. Flint had been lying near the garage door throughout the conversation. Suddenly, the German shepherd stood, not alarmed. He walked to Cullen and pressed his shoulder gently against Cullen's leg. Cullen looked down. The dog's amber eyes were not on the maps. They were on him. A small grounding gesture. Nothing mystical. Nothing impossible. Yet Cullen felt something inside him settle. 11 acres. Separate for 32 years. Preserved through business debts, family arguments, and Ezra's worst seasons. Maybe the strange part was not that Ezra had hidden something. Maybe the strange part was how long he had protected it before Cullen ever knew he needed protection. Cullen put one hand briefly against Flint's neck. Ostrander watched the exchange. Good dog. The best. Cullen looked again at the parcel map. The money mattered. But suddenly the decision behind the land mattered more. Ezra had separated it in 1994. Cullen had still been a boy. Whatever his father eventually intended, the foundation had been laid long before the family began treating Cullen like a failed investment. That realization followed him all the way back to Pine Haven. Warren called before Cullen reached the station. Dinner tonight. It was not phrased like an invitation. Cullen almost declined. Then he remembered the map. Time? 6:30. Fine. Warren and Peggy lived on the north side of town in a newer cedar-sided house overlooking a shallow wooded valley. Peggy Hartwell opened the door. She was 56, around 5'6", with a slender but soft build, fair skin lightly freckled across her cheeks, hazel eyes and shoulder-length light brown hair threaded with silver and tucked loosely behind one ear. She wore a cream knit blouse, dark slacks, and simple flats. Peggy was gentle by nature, but had spent 30 years married to a man whose certainty usually filled rooms before anyone else had a chance. Over time, she had become skilled at making conflict look temporarily civilized, refilling glasses, redirecting conversation, asking questions precisely when voices started to harden. She hugged Cullen lightly. You look better. People keep saying that. You dislike it? I don't know what to do with it. Peggy smiled. You could say thank you. Seems advanced. That earned a small laugh. Lucas arrived 10 minutes later. Dinner was roast chicken, potatoes, green beans, and a pie Peggy had clearly made to discourage argument through carbohydrates. It almost worked. Warren waited until everyone had eaten before he brought up the station. You thought any more about what I said? Yes, and I'm keeping it. Warren set down his fork. Cullen, keeping something and being able to carry it are different. I know. Roof alone could bury you. Pumps, wiring, environmental inspection. I said I know. Lucas looked toward Peggy. Peggy reached for the water pitcher. Warren leaned back. I'm trying to keep you from making your first big decision out of treatment into a financial disaster. There it was. Not contempt, something more difficult. Concern used as authority. Cullen kept his tone neutral. What exactly does the county need? Warren frowned. For what? Drainage project, frontage, creek access. Depends on engineering the station lot. Whole area. Cullen took a drink of water, including the acreage behind it. Warren stopped. Only for a fraction of a second. Then it all connects. Cullen watched him. Lucas did too. Warren continued eating. That tiny hesitation told Cullen more than denial would have. He did not press. The rest of dinner drifted toward safer subjects. Lucas talked about a transmission failure on one of the company trucks. Peggy asked Cullen whether he planned to stay at the station. Warren complained about insurance premiums. After pie, Cullen carried his plate toward the kitchen. On the way back from the bathroom, he heard Warren's voice in the hallway off the mudroom. Low, controlled. Cullen slowed. No, I already put 12 down. A pause. The truck's committed. Another pause. I know what the bank said. Warren sounded different when he believed nobody was listening. Less certain. More tired. I'm expecting estate distribution to cover part of the balance. Cullen remained still. Then Warren said, the demolition needs to stay on schedule. If the old frontage is cleared and title gets resolved, county acquisition can move clean. Silence. Then, no, I don't know what Ezra left in the box. Cullen's pulse slowed rather than accelerated. Focus. Whatever Cullen found, if it changes how the rear parcel falls into residual, I need to know before this gets too far. Cullen stepped away before the call ended. He returned to the living room, did not mention what he heard. Warren came back 2 minutes later, face composed. For the rest of the evening, Cullen understood the man better. Warren was not guarding a known fortune. He was protecting a calculation. He had already spent part of a future he assumed would arrive. That did not make him innocent. It made him dangerous in a more ordinary way. Scared people did ugly mathematics. On the drive home, Pine Haven's main street was nearly empty. A liquor store stood at the edge of town. Bright red sign, cold white interior lights. Cullen slowed, not consciously at first. Then the truck was rolling at 15 miles an hour. Flint stood in the back. The dog pushed his head between the front seats and rested his muzzle lightly against Cullen's shoulder. Cullen closed his eyes for 1 second. No longer. Not tonight. He kept driving. He did not feel heroic. That was another thing recovery had corrected. Sometimes surviving a bad moment felt exactly like turning right instead of left. The following morning, Cullen drove to the Pine Haven County Annex. The records counter was staffed by Marjorie Bell, a 61-year-old county clerk with a compact build, short iron gray hair, pale skin, square reading glasses, and the efficient manner of a woman who had spent 3 decades watching residents arrive angry about documents they had never bothered to read. She wore a burgundy cardigan over a white blouse and spoke without unnecessary drama. Address? Cullen gave it. She typed. Her expression changed slightly. There's an active petition. For what? Condemnation review and demolition authorization. Filed by? Marjorie turned the screen just enough for him to read. Warren Hartwell, personal representative, estate of Ezra Hartwell. Cullen felt no surprise, only confirmation. When? 3 days ago, before I got access to the station. Marjorie adjusted her glasses. I can tell you when it was filed. I can't tell you what your family knew when they filed it. Fair answer. What does the petition describe? Station structure, associated frontage, and property interests necessary to resolve county drainage planning. Associated frontage, property interests, language wide enough to be useful later. When's the hearing? She checked. 3 days. Cullen looked at the date. Near the same window in which he expected the bank access dispute to move. 2 separate processes, converging. Marjorie printed the petition. Advice? I'm a clerk. Meaning? Meaning my advice is worth exactly what the county pays me to practice law. Cullen almost smiled. She handed him the pages. But if I owned property listed in a demolition petition, I'd read every line before the hearing. That sounds suspiciously like advice. Then forget I said it. Outside, Flint waited in the truck, watching through the windshield. Cullen stood in the parking lot and read the filing once. Then again, he could feel the old instinct urging speed. Call Warren. Confront Lucas. Force an answer. Instead, Cullen folded the papers carefully. 3 days. A disputed bank box. 11 acres. A county project worth approximately $340,000. And an uncle who had already committed $12,000 to a truck using money he did not yet possess. Cullen opened the driver's door. Flint shifted over. Looks like we have homework. The dog settled into the passenger side space. Cullen started the engine. If he intended to keep what Ezra had left him, he would have to move quickly. But not recklessly. Those were not the same thing, and Cullen had lost enough years learning the difference. Cullen spent the next morning building a file thick enough to hurt somebody if he threw it. He did not throw it. That, in itself, felt like progress. On Ezra's old desk, he arranged the documents in chronological order. The main will naming Cullen as beneficiary of the filling station parcel, tax receipts for the property, photographs of the garage before and after the floor was opened, Graham Ostrander's survey showing the separate 11-acre tract, and county records establishing that the rear parcel carried its own legal description. He added photographs of the welded steel container beneath the hydraulic lift. Not because the photographs proved ownership. They did not, but they proved that whatever had led to Box 4471 had been deliberately placed there by someone with access to the station long before Cullen returned. Flint lay near the doorway, chin on his forepaws. The German Shepherd had learned the new rhythm of the place quickly. When Cullen worked with tools, Flint watched the room. When Cullen worked with papers, Flint watched Cullen. By 10 that morning, Earl arrived carrying 2 coffees, and the expression of a man already disappointed in both of them. "You look terrible," Earl said. "You said that yesterday. Still true." Cullen took 1 coffee. "Anything useful?" "Coffee. I meant advice." "Then no." Earl lowered himself carefully into the chair opposite the desk. Arthritis had made his movements slower, but never hesitant. He looked through Cullen's document stacks. "You need somebody who knows probate. I need somebody who can get me into that box." "Same thing." Earl pulled a folded business card from the front pocket of his Navy coveralls. "Name's Daniel Mercer." Cullen looked at it. "Daniel Mercer, attorney at law, estates, property, probate. You trust him?" "I trust him to read before he talks." "That rare? Rarer than honest mechanics." "Thought all mechanics were honest." Earl took a sip of coffee. "That's because you grew up around liars." Daniel Mercer's office occupied the 2nd floor above a pharmacy in downtown Pine Haven. He was 54, a little under 6 feet, lean rather than thin, with a narrow rectangular face, a straight nose, a defined but not heavy jaw, and close-trimmed salt and pepper stubble. His dark hair had gone silver at the sides and was receding slightly above the temples. His eyes were brown, steady, and mildly tired in the way of a man who spent most of his working life inside other people's family arguments. He wore a medium gray suit without a tie, pale blue shirt, black belt, and practical black leather shoes. Mercer's manner was quiet and unhurried. He did not finish other people's sentences. He did not offer reassurance before reading the papers. Years of estate disputes had apparently taught him that families often lied most effectively when convinced they were only explaining themselves. For 20 minutes, he said almost nothing. Then he looked up. "You don't need ownership of the box contents established before opening it." Cullen leaned forward. "I don't. You need authority to inspect and inventory potential estate property under supervision." "Different question." Warren objected. He had the right to object. "That doesn't mean he owns what's inside." "No." Mercer tapped the file. "And if the box contains documents directly relevant to title, keeping it sealed indefinitely creates its own problem. What do we do? Petition for limited authorization, narrow request, no distribution, no removal beyond certified copying unless ownership is clear on the face of the asset." Cullen appreciated the precision. "You can get that? I can ask for it." "How long?" Mercer's eyes shifted to the demolition hearing date. "If the court understands there is a pending property proceeding, possibly quickly." Earl, sitting beside Cullen, said, "Translation?" Mercer looked at him. "Stop talking and let me work." Earl nodded approvingly. "I like him." The authorization came sooner than Cullen expected, not because anyone favored him, because the request was limited enough to be difficult to oppose. Franklin First Credit Union received a probate order permitting Cullen, accompanied by the branch manager and a neutral witness, to inspect and inventory the contents of safe deposit box 4471. Nothing clearly belonging to the general estate could be distributed without further process. Documents could be copied. Assets showing a direct beneficiary designation could be separately identified. It was not victory. It was access. That was enough. Franklin First stood on the corner of Main and Grant in a low brick building, surrounded by maple trees, just beginning to turn at their edges. Carol Denny met Cullen and Earl inside. She was 59, about 5'6", with a medium build and the calm posture of someone who had worked behind financial counters long enough to recognize panic before customers did. Her face was oval, warm without being overly expressive, and fine smile lines framed hazel brown eyes. Her brown-gray hair reached her shoulders and was gathered into a low, neat tie. She wore a cream blouse beneath a charcoal cardigan, black slacks, low black leather shoes, and thin reading glasses she carried on a chain when not using them. Carol was kind, but procedure came first. That was one of the reasons Ezra had trusted her. Years earlier, when customers had asked for exceptions she could not legally make, Carol had learned to say no without humiliating them. She believed compassion worked best when it survived scrutiny. Her eyes lingered briefly on Cullen. "Your father talked about you." Cullen did not know what expression crossed his face, but Carol changed direction immediately. "Not today," she said. "Today we inventory." He was grateful. Flint could enter the public lobby but not the controlled vault area. A teller offered to keep an eye on him behind the customer service desk. Cullen gave Flint a quiet stay command. The German shepherd settled immediately, amber eyes following Cullen until the vault door closed between them. Carol led Cullen and Earl through a security corridor. Metal doors had a particular sound when they closed. Cullen had never liked it. The vault smelled cool and dry, like paper preserved against time. Carol used the bank's control key while Cullen inserted key 4471. Both turned. The lock released. The box was longer than Cullen expected, narrow and deep, made of dull metal scratched by years of movement along its track. Carol carried it to a small private viewing room. No windows. One table. 3 chairs. A camera positioned outside the privacy area rather than over the contents themselves. Carol placed an inventory form beside the box. Nothing leaves until it's documented. Cullen nodded. He rested both hands on the table, then lifted the lid. The first thing he saw was paper, bundles of old U.S. savings bonds, each protected inside sleeves or envelopes. For a moment, Cullen almost laughed. After the concrete, the welded steel, the hidden lockbox, the numbered key, he had expected something dramatic, stacks of cash, a confession, something movie-worthy. Instead, he had government paper. Earl leaned closer. "Well, that's becoming your favorite word," Cullen said. "I'm old. Vocabulary shrinks." Carol put on her glasses. "Don't assume these are insignificant." She lifted the first bond carefully, her expression sharpened. "Ezra Hartwell, payable on death to Cullen Wade Hartwell." Cullen looked at her. "Pod, payable on death beneficiary. So if the registration is valid, these do not pass through the residual estate the same way ordinary property would." She examined another. Same registration, then another. Same. Cullen sat down. Carol began recording serial numbers and dates. The bonds had been purchased over years, not all at once. One in spring, another in autumn, 2 the following year, then a gap, then more. The oldest were from a time Cullen was still in uniform and rarely home long enough to notice how thin Ezra's finances had become. Cullen began arranging them by date. Earl watched silently. "Dad was always broke," Cullen said. Carol did not look up. "Your father was often cash poor." "That sounds nicer." "It is not the same thing." She finished entering the last registration and excused herself to verify current redemption values through the bank's approved process. Cullen remained with Earl. On the table were years of Ezra Hartwell choosing not to spend something. That did not sound remarkable until Cullen thought about the man himself. Ezra hated waiting. He hated buying cheap tools because they broke. He hated deferred maintenance. He had once driven 40 miles in a snowstorm because a parts supplier claimed a bearing would arrive sometime next week. Yet here was evidence that he had practiced patience in the one place Cullen had never expected. Money, for him. Carol returned. Approximately $61,000. At current redemption value, Cullen stared. 61? Earl exhaled. That old fool. Cullen did not feel rich. He felt observed, as though Ezra had been sitting somewhere outside time, watching him learn the price of every assumption he had made about his father. Beneath the bonds was a stiff document sleeve. Inside rested a certified copy of a deed dated 1994. Cullen recognized the parcel number immediately. The rear tract, 11 acres. Ezra Hartwell is sole owner. Separate legal description. Separate parcel. The same facts Ostrander had already shown him, but certified now, preserved beside the bonds. Under that lay a thin brown folder. Carol's expression became more careful. "Let's document before opening." The folder contained an original testamentary codicil dated 2019. Cullen read the first paragraph once, then again. The language was plain enough. Ezra Hartwell identified the 11-acre parcel by legal description and expressly devised it to Cullen Wade Hartwell, separate and apart from any residuary division of the estate. At the bottom were signatures. Ezra, Earl Pritchard, Helen Marrow. Cullen looked at Earl. "You signed this." Earl's pale blue eyes remained on the page. "Yes, you knew. I knew about the document. You knew the acreage was mine. I knew what Ezra intended." Cullen's jaw tightened. "Why didn't you tell me?" Earl did not flinch. "Because he made me promise not to. He was dead. Promises don't die automatically because the person who asked for them does." Carol remained quiet, deliberately becoming invisible. Cullen pushed back from the table. Anger came fast. Not explosive. Worse. Cold. "You watched Warren handle the estate." "Yes." "You watched Lucas take over the trucking company." "Yes." "You watched me come back with nothing." "Yes, and you still said nothing." Earl's expression changed. Pain, brief and old. "I watched you come back sober." The words stopped Cullen. Earl continued. "That was the condition Ezra cared about. Not because sober made you morally superior. Because it meant you had a fighting chance to keep whatever came next." Cullen looked away. The folder contained one more sheet, yellow legal paper, folded twice. His name was written on the outside. Cullen, No legal heading, no witness line, a letter. His hands were steadier opening that letter than they had been leaving detox. The first sentence hurt more than he expected. If you are reading this, then I never managed to say it right while I was sober and looking you in the eye. Cullen stopped. Earl looked down at his hands. Carol removed her glasses. Cullen continued. Ezra wrote that he had tried to quit drinking 3 times and failed each time. He wrote that he was ashamed of arriving at Cullen's treatment facility drunk. He admitted he had gone there intending to tell his son he was proud of him for trying. Instead, he had shown Cullen another example of what failure looked like. There was no excuse in the letter, no request to be remembered kindly, only acknowledgement. Then came the land. There are 11 acres, count them carefully. Ezra wrote that each acre represented something he had kept separate because he did not trust himself to explain it without turning the conversation into an argument. He did not know when Cullen would come home. He did not know whether he would be alive when it happened. He only knew that if Cullen ever returned ready to build again, he wanted something to remain standing still long enough for his son to find it. Cullen reached the final line and stopped. It read, I could not promise I would become the father you needed. I could promise I would leave something behind that did not move when the rest of us did. For several seconds the room disappeared, not literally. There was still the table, the metal box, Carol, Earl, but Cullen was also 29 again, listening to Ezra criticize how he managed money. 34, ignoring his father's calls. 39, sitting outside treatment convinced everyone who claimed to love him had already started preparing for his failure. He had believed Ezra's secrecy meant distrust. The letter did not erase the damage between them. It did something harder. It made the damage coexist with love. Cullen folded the letter carefully. Earl said, You all right? No. A pause, better than I expected. Earl nodded. That counts. Cullen assumed there could not possibly be another surprise. He was wrong. They completed the inventory, signed the documentation, and prepared to leave. In the lobby, Flint rose the moment Cullen came through the secured door. He walked directly to Cullen and leaned his shoulder against Cullen's thigh. Cullen rested one hand briefly between the dog's ears. Carol approached holding a printed account summary. There's one more thing. Cullen looked at her. What? When I was reviewing your father's customer profile for the court inventory, I found a separate savings account. Part of the estate? Not exactly. She handed him the paper. The account nickname read, Cullen just in case beneficiary designation. Cullen Wade Hartwell. PUD current balance, $2,120. Stared at the number. Carol explained the deposits. $40, $50, sometimes $60, occasionally nothing for a month or two. Then another small deposit. The account had begun around the period Cullen first entered treatment years earlier. $2,120, Cullen said. Carol nodded. It was almost absurd. He had just seen $61,000 in bonds. He had a legal document pointing toward land connected to a county project worth hundreds of thousands. Yet $2,120 was the number that broke something open. Because that amount was ordinary. It was motel money, groceries, gas, a security deposit, a cheap month of surviving. Ezra had apparently imagined his son coming home not as a victorious former SEAL, not repaired, not wealthy, just broke and trying. Cullen sat in one of the lobby chairs. Flint lowered himself beside him. Carol spoke gently. Your father started that account after he came in one morning and asked what the smallest automatic transfer we could set up was. Cullen looked up. He asked that? He said he wanted something that could keep growing even if he forgot about it. Did he say why? Carol hesitated. He said, boy might need a place to land. Cullen closed his eyes. That sentence was worse than the money, or better. He could not tell. The zoning hearing was the following afternoon. Cullen arrived carrying one folder, not 3 boxes, not a speech, one folder. The municipal meeting room smelled of old carpet and burnt coffee. About 20 folding chairs faced a long dais beneath the county seal. The board chair was Dwayne Felton, 62, a heavy-set man with thinning gray hair, ruddy skin, and the patient expression of someone accustomed to arguments over fences, driveways, drainage ditches, and people convinced zoning law was a personal insult. He wore a brown sport coat over a white shirt and read every document before commenting. 2 other board members sat beside him. Warren occupied the first row. Lucas sat 1 chair away. Peggy sat behind them. Earl came with Cullen. Ostrander arrived carrying a rolled copy of the survey. The hearing began as administrative business. Parcel address, structural condition, demolition request, estate representative. Then Dwayne asked whether any interested owner objected. Cullen stood. I do. Warren looked back. Cullen walked to the front. He did not accuse. He documented. First, the main will showing the filling station parcel was specifically devised to him. Second, tax receipts demonstrating there was no simple unpaid tax basis for immediate action. Third, Ostrander's survey establishing that the rear 11 acres constituted a separate parcel. Then the certified 1994 deed. Then the 2019 codicil. At that, Warren's face changed, not dramatically. But Cullen saw the color drain slightly around his mouth. Warren had known the land, he had not known the document. Dwayne read the codicil twice. "Mr. Hartwell," he said to Warren, "were you aware this existed?" "No." "Is its validity currently adjudicated?" "No." "Then we have an unresolved title issue." Ostrander was invited forward. He explained the distinction between the station parcel and rear parcel, the drainage corridor, construction access, and the preliminary compensation range. "Approximately $340,000, he said. Dwayne raised an eyebrow. "For the land?" "No, for the easement package and associated impacts." The correction mattered. Warren leaned forward. "This board isn't probate court." "No," Dwayne said, "and we're not pretending to be." Cullen appreciated him immediately. The board recessed for 10 minutes. When they returned, Dwayne announced that the demolition authorization would be suspended pending clarification of ownership and review of structural necessity. County acquisition discussions involving the rear parcel would likewise pause until title was resolved. It was not a declaration that Cullen owned everything. It was something more useful at that moment. Time. Warren had lost his ability to outrun the paperwork. After the meeting, Cullen expected confrontation. None came. Warren walked past him without speaking. Lucas lingered for half a second, eyes flicking toward the folder in Cullen's hand, then followed Warren outside. Earl waited until the room emptied. "Well," he said. Cullen looked at him. "You really need another word. I'm 71, too late to learn one." 3 days later, rain began before dawn. Cullen was in the office repairing a shelf when a postal carrier brought a certified envelope requiring signature. The return address belonged to a law firm in Duluth. Cullen signed. Flint lay near the counter. Earl had not arrived yet. Cullen opened the envelope alone. The first page identified Warren Hartwell as petitioner. The second challenged the 2019 codicil, not for improper signatures, not because the parcel description was wrong, not because Ezra lacked ownership. The challenge attacked Ezra himself. It cited his history of alcohol abuse, prior treatment attempts, periods of relapse. It alleged that these facts created substantial reason to question whether Ezra possessed testamentary capacity when he signed the codicil in 2019. Cullen read the paragraph twice. The room seemed colder. For days, he had thought the dispute was about who owned 11 acres. It was not anymore. Warren had chosen a different battlefield. To take the land, he would argue that Ezra's worst years mattered more than his clear decisions, that a man who had once been impaired could not be trusted to have ever been clear. Cullen lowered the paper. Flint raised his head. Cullen looked toward the old photograph of Ezra still propped on the office shelf. For the first time since returning to Pine Haven, Cullen felt anger without confusion. Not because Warren wanted the land, because Warren had decided the easiest way to get it was to turn Ezra Hartwell's failures into a definition of the entire man. Cullen folded the legal notice once, very carefully, then set it on the desk. The next fight would not be about a filling station. It would be about whether a person could survive the worst thing he had ever been and still be believed when he tried to do something right. Renata Cole read Warren Hartwell's petition without interrupting herself once. No sigh. No raised eyebrow, no small noise of outrage offered for Cullen's benefit. She read the first page, turned it over, read the second, then returned to the beginning and underlined 3 sentences with a mechanical pencil. Cullen sat across from her in a quiet office overlooking a narrow street in Duluth. Flint lay beside his chair. At 52, Renata was about 5'7", slender and straight-backed, with controlled movements that made even reaching for a legal pad look deliberate. Her face was sharply defined without being severe, with a clear chin, moderate cheekbones, and dark brown eyes that seemed to separate useful information from emotional decoration almost automatically. Her dark brown hair, lightly silvered near the temples, fell neatly to just above her shoulders. She wore a fitted charcoal blazer over an ivory blouse, matching charcoal trousers, low black leather shoes, and a small plain-faced watch. Renata had spent more than 20 years handling contested estates. That career had stripped her of one habit most people considered comforting. She did not promise outcomes. Families, she had learned, often entered probate court believing love could prove ownership, resentment could erase signatures, or memory could defeat paper simply by being louder. Renata believed none of those things. She believed in dates, witnesses, contemporaneous records, and questions narrow enough that the answer mattered. She finally placed Warren's petition flat on the desk. Your uncle is not arguing that Ezra did not own the property. No. He is not claiming the signatures are forged. No. He is not claiming the parcel description is wrong. No. Renata tapped the underlined paragraph. He is saying Ezra may not have understood what he was doing when he signed. Cullen's jaw tightened. He understood. Renata looked at him. That is not evidence. Cullen leaned back. Flint's ears shifted at the change in his breathing. Renata noticed. She seemed to notice most things. What do you need? Cullen asked. The wrong question. Then give me the right one. Renata folded her hands. Was Ezra Hartwell mentally competent at the specific time he executed the codicil? Cullen said nothing. Renata continued. Your father could have been drunk the month before. He could have relapsed the month after. He could have been difficult, ashamed, depressed, angry, or physically ill. None of those things automatically answer the legal question. So Warren can't just use his drinking history. He can use it. That's not what I asked. No, he cannot make general history substitute for evidence about capacity at execution. Cullen looked toward the window. That sounds almost fair. Probate occasionally manages it. Her mouth moved just enough to suggest dry humor. Cullen appreciated that. What do we build? Witnesses first. Earl Pritchard came to Renata's office 2 days later wearing the same old Navy mechanic's coveralls he wore almost everywhere except funerals. Renata looked at the oil stain near one knee. You own other clothes? Somewhere. She did not smile. Earl did. Barely. Cullen sat in the corner while Renata questioned him. Flint lay near the wall. March 2019, Renata began. Tell me about the day Ezra signed the codicil. Earl rubbed his thumb against one enlarged knuckle. Tuesday. You are certain? Station was closed early Tuesdays that winter because Ezra had started doing supply runs in Duluth Wednesdays. He asked me to stay after. Time? Little after 4. What condition was he in? Annoyed. Renata looked up. At what? Coffee maker. Cullen glanced at Earl. Earl continued. Thing leaked all over the counter. Ezra spent 15 minutes fixing a $6 machine because throwing it away offended him personally. Renata wrote something down. Was he drinking? No. Could he have been? Earl's pale blue eyes sharpened. I worked beside him almost 20 years. If Ezra had whiskey on his breath, I knew. If his hands were slow, I knew. If he started repeating himself, I knew. And that afternoon, stone sober. What happened next? He made coffee. Bad coffee. Sat at the kitchen table in the back room. Had the document in a folder. Did he read it? Twice. To himself, first time to himself. Second time out loud. Why? Because he wanted me to hear the parcel number. Renata paused. He specifically discussed the parcel? Yes. What did he say? Earl looked toward Cullen, then back at Renata. He said the filling station was already dealt with in the main will. This was the land behind it. He wanted them kept separate. Did he identify Cullen? By full name. Did he explain why? Earl hesitated. He said the boy had spent most of his adult life carrying things nobody could see. He wanted to leave him one thing nobody could argue away. Cullen looked down. Renata did not. Did he use those exact words? Close enough. I'm not pretending I remember every syllable. Good. Earl frowned. Good. I trust witnesses more when they know what they do not remember. That earned Renata 1 point in Earl's private system. Cullen could tell. Finding Helen Marrow took longer. She had moved 40 miles west after retiring from bookkeeping and now lived in a pale yellow house beside a narrow lake. When Cullen called, she remembered Ezra immediately. She remembered Cullen too. You were the boy who took apart the Coke machine because it ate your quarter. I was 12. You still owe the station 75 cents. Inflation? Considerable. They met at Helen's house the following afternoon. Helen was 64, about 5'5", small-framed and quick in her movements despite her age. Her face was softly round with fair skin and fine lines around clear gray-blue eyes that missed very little. Her short bobbed hair was silver-gray mixed with traces of pale blonde. Reading glasses hung from a thin cord around her neck. She wore a forest green cardigan over a cream blouse, dark brown trousers, and practical low shoes. Helen had spent 30 years doing books for small businesses, which had given her a deep suspicion of people who said numbers were close enough. She was direct without being cruel, meticulous without being fussy, and had never been close enough to the Hartwell family to feel obligated to protect any of them. That made her useful. Renata joined by video call while Cullen sat at Helen's kitchen table. Flint lay near the screen door, occasionally watching 2 ducks move across the lake. Helen had already pulled a small file box from a closet. I kept copies of my old timesheets and notary logs, she said. Cullen stared. You still have records from 2019? I still have a receipt from a toaster I returned in 2008. That answers that. Helen adjusted her glasses. The codicil was signed March 19th. Renata's voice came through the laptop. You witnessed Ezra sign it? I did. What did you observe? He was irritated because Earl had written the wrong parcel number on a scratch pad. Earl, who had come with Cullen, muttered from the other side of the table. I wrote 1 digit backward. Helen looked at him. You wrote 2. 1 was ambiguous. It was a 7. It had personality. Cullen looked away so nobody saw him smile. Helen continued. Ezra had the legal description in front of him. He read the parcel identification number, then asked me to compare it with the county tax sheet. Why? He said if he was going to leave something separate, he wanted it separate correctly. Renata asked, did he appear confused at any point? Helen's expression changed, not offended, almost surprised. No. Did he repeat questions? No. Forget where he was? No. Misidentify anyone? No. Appear intoxicated? Helen removed her glasses entirely. No. She leaned slightly toward the laptop. I saw Ezra Hartwell intoxicated before. Everybody who worked at that station long enough did. He got quieter when he drank, not louder. His eyes lost focus before his speech did. On March 19th, he corrected my math. Earl said, that proves nothing. Your math needed correcting. Helen ignored him. Renata asked, did Ezra discuss why Cullen was receiving the parcel? Helen looked across the table at Cullen. He did. Cullen felt something in his chest tighten. What did he say? Helen seemed to weigh whether memory belonged to truth or kindness. Then she answered, he said Cullen was not ready yet. Cullen's fingers went still. Earl looked at Helen. Renata's voice remained neutral. Ready for what? The land, responsibility, coming home. I don't know which one he meant. Cullen heard the old accusation immediately. Not ready. Still broken. Still the family problem. Helen saw his expression. You're hearing that wrong. Cullen looked at her. How should I hear it? She folded her hands over the table. He did not say you were not worthy. Her voice softened only slightly. He said you were not ready yet. The word sat between them. Yet. Not never. Not lost. Not finished. Helen stood, walked to the file box, and removed a yellow carbon copy from beneath several old payroll sheets. I wrote this down because Ezra made me check the parcel number 3 times. At the bottom of Helen's bookkeeping note was a sentence in her handwriting. EH says this stays separate until Cullen can stand on it himself. Cullen read it once, then again. The note was not a legal document. It proved no ownership. It did not replace the codicil. But it had been written on the same afternoon by a woman with no reason to invent anything 6 years later. Cullen looked through the screen door. Flint had risen and was watching him. The dog did not come over. He did not need to. Something about the word yet had already done the work. For years, Cullen had believed his family's judgment came with a period. Ezra, apparently, had left room for a comma. Carol Denny's contribution arrived 3 days later. Not a letter saying Ezra had been a good man. Renata specifically did not want that. Instead, Carol produced account histories, transaction records, beneficiary forms, and dates. Cullen met her in a small conference room at Franklin First. Carol wore the same cream blouse and charcoal cardigan, reading glasses low on her nose as she turned pages. Your father was particular about balances, she said. How particular? He once called because our online banking showed a 73-cent difference from his notebook. Who was wrong? Carol looked at him. The bank. Cullen smiled. That probably made his year. It made my week worse. The records showed no pattern of confusion around the period of the codicil. Ezra made regular deposits, paid property taxes on time, renewed a certificate correctly, updated payable on death beneficiaries, purchased bonds according to a recognizable long-term pattern. He also created the small savings account for Cullen and never withdrew from it. Renata later explained why the banking evidence mattered. No single transaction proves testamentary capacity. But together, they show functioning, meaning Warren wants the court to picture a man living in uninterrupted chaos. And Dad wasn't, not all the time. That distinction mattered to Cullen more than he expected. He had spent years seeing Ezra as 2 separate men, the father who taught him to gap spark plugs, and the drunk man outside treatment. Sobriety had forced Cullen to accept that they had always been the same person. Good days did not erase bad ones. Bad days did not erase every good one either. It was a less satisfying truth than blame. It was also harder to escape. Medical records became the problem. Ezra had been treated at North Shore Regional Clinic several times in the years before his death, including after a mild neurological scare in 2018. Renata requested the relevant chart through the estate process. Then they waited. A week passed, then another. Waiting gave Cullen too much room to think. During the day he worked at the station. He patched a leak temporarily, cleaned the office, sorted rusted hardware, took Flint along Foxglass Creek. At night the questions grew larger. What if Warren was right? Not morally, factually. What if Ezra had already been declining? What if the codicil had come during a period of confusion nobody wanted to admit? What if Earl remembered the good version because guilt needed him to? What if Helen remembered certainty because 6 years had polished the edges? Cullen hated himself for thinking it, then hated Warren for making him think it, then hated Ezra for leaving a mystery large enough that everyone still alive had to prove what kind of man he had been. One night, Cullen sat alone behind the station counter. Rain touched the roof lightly. The letter from Box 4471 lay open beside him. Flint rested near his boots. Cullen looked at the dog. You know what I like about you? Flint did not move. You never hid legal documents. One ear lifted. You never made me track down witnesses. Flint yawned. Exactly. Cullen laughed. Not much, but enough. He reached down and rubbed the dog behind one ear. The laugh faded. I'm angry at a dead man. Flint leaned slightly into his hand. I think that's allowed. No answer. Good. Cullen had spent too much of his life around people who believed every difficult emotion required immediate correction. Treatment had taught him otherwise. Some feelings only needed to be survived without obeying them. He folded Ezra's letter and put it away. That night he did not drink. The next morning Renata called. The records came. Dr. Samuel Feld had treated Ezra during the period Warren's petition now questioned. The doctor was 67, about 5'10", with a medium, slightly lean build and a long face under a high forehead. His short silver-white hair had thinned substantially on top. Light blue-brown eyes sat behind fine wire-framed glasses. He wore a light blue dress shirt beneath a navy sport coat, gray trousers, and dark brown leather shoes. He had the calm, economical manner of a physician who had spent decades delivering information people often wished were different. He did not dramatize. He did not soften facts to make them easier. He also did not confuse a diagnosis with a person. Cullen and Renata met him at his clinic. Dr. Feld opened Ezra's chart. I remember your father. Cullen waited. He disliked waiting rooms. That sounds right. He also believed appointment times were bilateral contracts. Renata almost smiled. Dr. Feld adjusted his glasses. I examined him 4 months before the codicil date you provided. He turned the chart toward them. The clinical note was concise. Patient alert. Oriented to person, place, time. Cognition intact. No evidence of impairment during examination. Cullen read it. Once. Twice. Renata remained still. Dr. Feld continued. There is more. Below the examination summary sat a longer note. Ezra had initiated a conversation about long-term planning, not because Dr. Feld was his lawyer, because the doctor had asked whether Ezra had support at home, and whether he had organized practical affairs in case his health worsened. Ezra answered that he had. Then the sentence Cullen had not expected. Patient describes separately held land parcel he intends to preserve for adult son. Demonstrates clear understanding of ownership distinction and expresses concern that parcel remain outside shared business interests. Cullen did not speak. Renata read the sentence carefully. Doctor, did you prompt him toward that specific asset? No. Did he appear confused about who owned it? No. Did he appear confused about who he wanted to receive it? No. Any evidence of intoxication? No. Cogged during that visit. Dr. Feld leaned back. I can only testify to what I observed and documented. Renata nodded. That is all I would ask. Cullen looked at the date. 4 months before the codicil. Ezra had already been thinking about the land, already distinguishing it from the business, already thinking about Cullen. The codicil had not appeared from nowhere at a kitchen table. It belonged to a plan. Back at Renata's office, the evidence occupied one long conference table. Earl's testimony, Helen's contemporaneous note, banking records, Dr. Feld's chart, the codicil, the deed. Renata stood at the end of the table. Warren's case depends on collapsing your father's entire history into one proposition, that he drank. That because he had periods of impairment, every legal act should be viewed through impairment. Cullen looked at the medical note. And ours? We do not argue that Ezra never had a problem, because he did. Yes, we do not argue he never failed. He did. Yes. Renata looked directly at Cullen. We argue something narrower and stronger. She placed one finger on the 2019 codicil. When Ezra Hartwell decided what should happen to this parcel, he knew what property he owned, knew who his family members were, understood the effect of the document, and expressed the same intent before and during execution. Cullen exhaled slowly. So we don't make him better than he was. No, we make them look at who he actually was. Renata nodded. On the days that matter, that sentence stayed with Cullen, not because he agreed entirely. All days mattered somehow. Even the bad ones. Especially the bad ones, perhaps. But no single day had the right to own all the others. The probate court scheduled the hearing for the following week. When Cullen returned to Pinehaven that evening, the sun was low above the birches, turning the upper leaves gold. He parked outside the station. Flint jumped down and waited. Cullen stood in the gravel lot instead of going inside. For weeks, he had followed Ezra's trail. Steel, paper, land, witnesses, bank records, medical notes. Each discovery had seemed like another layer his father had forced him to uncover. Now the feeling had changed. The next step would not be another hidden object. There was nothing left to excavate. Ezra had already made his decisions. The people still alive would decide whether those decisions deserved to be believed. Cullen looked at Flint. "Guess we stop looking now." The German shepherd stood quietly beside him. Cullen rested one hand on the old dog's neck. For the first time since returning to Pinehaven, he understood his role clearly. He was no longer searching for what his father had left behind. He was preparing to stand beside it. The courthouse opened at 8:30. Cullen arrived at 7:50. Old habits. In another life, arriving 40 minutes early had meant checking exits, sight lines, vehicles, the behavior of people pretending not to watch. Today there were no hostile rooftops, no radios, no weapons. Just a brick county courthouse in morning light, wet maple leaves stuck to the sidewalk after an overnight rain, and a man in an old red and black flannel shirt trying not to think too far past 9 o'clock. Flint stood beside him at the bottom of the courthouse steps. The 7-year-old German shepherd was quiet. Black and tan coat darkened slightly by the damp air, amber eyes moving between Cullen and the people entering the building. His coyote brown working harness sat snug against his chest. Flint was not a legally designated service animal. That meant he could not simply accompany Cullen into the courtroom. Cullen understood the rule. Understanding did not make leaving him outside the room easier. Earl Pritchard waited beside his truck near the curb, one hand resting on his dark wooden cane. He had traded his usual grease-marked coveralls for a clean navy pair, which apparently represented the outer limit of formal wear in Earl's philosophy. "Come on," Earl said to Flint. "Courtrooms are mostly people lying slower than usual." Renata, standing a few feet away in her charcoal suit, glanced at him. "Excellent. Please don't say that inside. I wasn't planning to." "You frequently say things you weren't planning to. That's why they're honest." Cullen almost smiled. Then Flint stepped closer. The dog did not whine. He did not resist Earl. He simply raised his head and pressed the broad bridge of his muzzle into Cullen's palm. A familiar gesture, warm fur, steady pressure. Cullen curled his fingers around Flint's head for a moment. "I'm good." Flint remained there. Cullen corrected himself. "I'll manage." The dog released him. Better answer. Earl led Flint toward the truck. Cullen watched until the passenger door closed. Then he turned toward the courthouse. Renata was already moving. "Ready?" "No." "Good." He looked at her. People who think they're ready usually talk too much. Together they walked inside. The probate courtroom was smaller than Cullen expected. Dark wood paneling ran halfway up the walls. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. A framed portrait of a judge who had probably been dead longer than Cullen had been alive hung slightly crooked behind the bench. Warren sat at the opposite table with his attorney. Preston Voss was 57, tall and narrow, with a carefully maintained build, a long angular face, strong chin and close-set gray eyes that rarely rested on anything for more than a few seconds. His dark hair was combed straight back and silvered evenly at the temples. He was clean-shaven and dressed in a dark navy suit, white shirt, and conservative burgundy tie. Voss had spent years handling commercial disputes and estate litigation in Duluth. He was not theatrical. That made him more effective. He spoke softly, framed accusations as reasonable concerns, and had a talent for making suspicion sound responsible. He greeted Renata politely. Then Cullen. "Mr. Hartwell." "Mr. Voss." Warren did not greet him. At 58, Warren still carried himself like the largest obligation in any room belonged to him. His dark denim work shirt had been replaced for the hearing by a collared version of nearly the same color, but otherwise he looked unchanged. Broad torso, square face, brown-gray eyes, heavily silvered temples. Cullen noticed something he had not expected. Warren looked tired. Not frightened, not guilty, tired. That complicated the anger. Lucas sat in the gallery behind him, wearing his dark tan work jacket over the same charcoal Henley he favored at the trucking yard. His blue-gray-brown eyes met Cullen's briefly, then dropped. Peggy sat beside him. Carol Denny, Helen Marrow, and Dr. Samuel Feld waited farther down the row. The room was not crowded. This was not a spectacle. It was a family dispute with enough paper to require a judge. At precisely 9, the side door opened. Judge Eileen Marsh entered. She was 63, about 5'7", with a compact upright posture and a composed oval face framed by short steel gray hair. Her skin was fair, her eyes dark blue, and fine lines around her mouth suggested someone who had spent years suppressing reactions until witnesses finished speaking. Beneath the black judicial robe, only the collar of a pale gray blouse was visible. Judge Marsh had served in probate and civil court for nearly 15 years. She had a reputation for patience with confusion and very little patience with performance. Her questions were usually short. Her silences were often more dangerous than interruptions. Everyone rose. The hearing began. Voss built Warren's case carefully. That was the first thing Cullen noticed. He did not call Ezra incompetent. He did not call him a drunk. He did not insult the dead man directly. Instead, he constructed a sequence. Ezra Hartwell had a documented history of alcohol dependency. There had been failed treatment attempts, periods of relapse, an alcohol-related driving incident years before the codicil, episodes in which family members had questioned his judgment. The codicil had been executed outside a law office, at a kitchen table, without the drafting attorney physically present. Voss never said, therefore Ezra lacked capacity. He said, taken together, these facts create substantial uncertainty as to whether Mr. Hartwell fully understood the testamentary consequences of the instrument at the time he executed it. Cullen almost admired the craftsmanship. Almost. Voss was not proving impairment. He was building fog. And hoping Judge Marsh would decide fog was enough to distrust the road underneath. Warren kept his eyes on the table. Renata made notes. When Voss finished, Judge Marsh asked one question. Do you have evidence Mr. Hartwell was intoxicated on March 19, 2019? Voss paused. Not direct evidence, Your Honor. Medical evidence of cognitive impairment on that date? Not on that date specifically. Judge Marsh nodded once. Proceed. Nothing in her expression changed, but Cullen felt the shape of the hearing sharpen. Earl testified first for Cullen. He walked to the witness stand using his cane and lowered himself into the chair with a small grimace he would have denied if asked. Renata kept the question simple. How long did you know Ezra Hartwell? 41 years. How long did you work with him? Just under 20. Were you present when he signed the 2019 codicil? Yes. What was his condition? How do you know? Earl looked at her. Because I knew him drunk. A few people in the gallery shifted. Renata waited. Earl continued. I knew how his eyes changed. Knew how his hands changed. Knew when he'd start checking something twice because he was careful. And when he'd check it twice because he forgot, he checked it once. Renata asked, which was it that afternoon? Careful. He described Ezra reading the codicil. Described the parcel number. The distinction between the station property and the 11-acre tract. Ezra's insistence that the second parcel remain separate. Then Voss stood for cross-examination. Mr. Pritchard, you cared deeply for Ezra Hartwell. Yes. You considered him your closest friend? Some years. Voss tilted his head. Only some. Other years he was a pain in the ass. Judge Marsh looked over her glasses. Earl said, sorry. A faint sound moved through the gallery. Voss continued. So you were not a neutral observer? No. Your affection may influence your memory. It might. That answer seemed to surprise Voss. You agree? I cared about the man. Earl leaned forward slightly. That doesn't mean I forgot what he looked like when he drank. Voss glanced at his notes. 6 years have passed. Can you honestly say you remember one Tuesday afternoon with complete accuracy? No. Cullen's stomach tightened. Voss paused. Earl continued before he could. I don't remember what socks I wore. A few people smiled. I don't remember whether the coffee was Maxwell House or Folger's. Then Earl's pale eyes hardened. I remember Ezra was sober because he and I argued for 20 minutes over a parcel number, and he caught my mistake before Helen did. Helen whispered from the gallery. I caught it first. Judge Marsh looked toward her. Helen straightened. Sorry. This time even Renata's mouth moved. Earl finished. I remember the things that matter. Voss sat down. Helen came next. She testified to the signing procedure. Ezra identified himself, reviewed the document, read the legal description, asked her to compare the parcel number with the county sheet, signed in front of both witnesses. Helen's small frame looked almost delicate in the large witness chair, but her gray-blue eyes remained steady. Voss tried another angle. Mrs. Marrow, you were a bookkeeper, yes, not a physician. Correct. So you cannot diagnose cognitive impairment? No. Then when you say Mr. Hartwell seemed competent, I didn't say competent. Voss stopped. Helen continued. I said he knew what parcel he was signing over, knew who he was giving it to, and knew it was separate from the station property. Her voice remained mild. If you want the medical word for that, ask a doctor. Judge Marsh wrote something down. Cullen began to understand why Ezra had trusted Helen with numbers. Carol Denny's testimony was less dramatic. That made it useful. She discussed banking records, beneficiary designations, savings transactions, the timing of bond purchases, Ezra's management of balances. She did not tell stories about his kindness. Renata had prepared her well. Instead, Carol painted Ezra through habits. A man who noticed discrepancies. A man who updated account information deliberately. A man who maintained separate beneficiary structures across multiple assets. Voss asked whether financial competence on Monday guaranteed testamentary capacity on Tuesday. Carol said no. He asked whether Ezra could have been sober at the credit union and intoxicated elsewhere. Carol said yes. Cullen saw Warren look up for the first time. Then Carol added, "But if you are asking whether his financial behavior during that period showed sustained confusion, the answer is no." Warren looked down again. Dr. Samuel Feld was called after lunch. The courtroom had become warmer. Cullen had consumed too much bad courthouse coffee and not enough food. Fatigue made edges sharper. Dr. Feld took the oath and sat with his hands loosely folded. Renata established his credentials. Years in family and internal medicine. Experience treating older adults. Treatment relationship with Ezra. Then she turned to the chart. "Did you evaluate Mr. Hartwell approximately 4 months before the codicil?" "Yes." "Your observations?" "Alert. Fully oriented. Cognition intact on examination. No evidence of impairment." "Did he discuss planning for the future?" "Yes." "Did you initiate discussion of the specific parcel?" "No." "What happened?" "I asked about support systems and whether his affairs were organized given a prior health concern." Dr. Feld adjusted his glasses. "He volunteered that he owned a parcel separately from shared business interests and intended it for his son." Cullen kept his eyes on the table. He had heard the information before. Hearing it under oath was different. Voss rose. "Doctor, prolonged alcohol misuse can contribute to cognitive decline, correct?" "Yes." "Memory issues?" "Yes." "Impaired judgment?" "Yes." "Executive dysfunction?" "Yes." Voss moved slowly. "So Mr. Hartwell's history placed him at elevated risk, generally speaking. Then how can you exclude impairment?" Dr. Feld looked at him calmly. "I did not exclude the possibility that he could ever be impaired. I documented what I observed when I examined him." Voss pressed. "A single examination cannot guarantee capacity months later." "No." "Then your note does not prove he was competent when he signed the codicil." "By itself, no." Voss turned slightly toward the judge. "Thank you." He began to sit. Dr. Feld added, "The general risk does not replace a specific examination of a specific patient." Voss stopped. Judge Marsh looked up. Dr. Feld continued with the same even tone. "I examined Ezra Hartwell. I did not examine a statistic." The room became very still. Then Renata asked one final question. "Doctor, when Ezra described the land parcel, did he merely mention owning land?" Dr. Feld looked at his note. "No. He distinguished it from the family business, identified the intended beneficiary as his son, and expressed concern that the parcel remain outside shared business ownership." Renata said, "So 4 months before the codicil, the central distinction later written into that document already existed in his thinking?" "Yes." Cullen looked across the room. Warren had finally raised his head. His face did not show anger. It showed recognition. For one brief second, Cullen understood that Warren was hearing something new too. Ezra had not created the plan secretly in one questionable afternoon. He had carried it independently, deliberately, for months. Warren's eyes met Cullen's. There was no triumph in the moment, only two men realizing that the dead had made decisions without consulting either of them. Then Warren looked away. Cullen was the final witness. "Renata kept him there less than 15 minutes. Was your father perfect?" "No." "Did he struggle with alcohol?" "Yes." "Did his drinking damage your relationship?" "Yes." "Did he ever hurt you emotionally?" Cullen paused. "Yes." Renata did not soften. "Give the court an example." Cullen knew which one. "He came to a treatment center when I was trying to get sober." "In what condition?" "He'd been drinking." "How did that make you feel?" "Like he had no right to ask me to become something he couldn't become himself." Silence. "Did you forgive him then?" "No." "Do you forgive everything now?" Cullen looked toward Ezra's codicil on the evidence table. "No." That answer surprised several people. Renata did not react. "Why not?" "Because learning he loved me doesn't change everything he did wrong." Cullen drew a slow breath. "And everything he did wrong doesn't make every good decision imaginary." Renata let the sentence rest. "What did your father tell you about the filling station?" Cullen answered carefully. "He said he hadn't left me the pumps." "What did he mean?" "I didn't know then." And now Cullen looked toward Judge Marsh rather than Warren. "I think he meant the value wasn't what everyone could see sitting above ground. He told me to count carefully. For 4 years I thought that was the kind of thing a drunk man says when he wants to sound wiser than he is. His throat tightened. He continued. Now I think he had been planning too long and talking too little. Voss crossed him briefly. He brought up Cullen's estrangement, his treatment history, his absence around the time Ezra died. The implication was obvious. Cullen had motive to interpret everything in the most favorable way. Cullen did not fight it. I have motive. Voss looked almost pleased. Cullen added, that's why you shouldn't decide this case based on what I think. He looked toward Dr. Feld, Earl, Helen, Carol. Use the records. Voss did not ask another question. Judge Marsh called a short recess. Cullen stood in the hallway near a window overlooking the parking lot. He could see Earl's truck. Flint was probably asleep inside it. The thought made him strangely calm. Renata stood nearby, reading nothing on her phone. How'd I do? Cullen asked. You answered. That good? Usually. 20 minutes later they returned. Judge Marsh did not delay. She summarized Warren's argument first. A documented history of alcohol misuse. Past episodes of impaired judgment. A codicil executed outside a traditional law office. Then she turned to the evidence offered by Cullen. 2 witnesses present at execution, both describing a sober, deliberate testator, banking behavior consistent with organized financial management, a contemporaneous medical evaluation showing intact cognition, and, importantly, a medical note documenting the same specific estate intention months before the codicil. Judge Marsh folded her hands. The petitioner has demonstrated that Ezra Hartwell experienced periods in his life during which alcohol affected his judgment. Cullen felt Warren shift across the aisle. That fact is not disputed, she continued. The question before this court, however, is not whether Mr. Hartwell was always unimpaired. It is whether he possessed testamentary capacity when he executed the codicil. She looked down at the document. The record before me establishes that he did. Warren went very still. The 2019 codicil is valid and enforceable. Parcel B, consisting of the 11-acre tract identified therein, passes to Cullen Wade Hartwell pursuant to that instrument. The petition contesting the codicil is denied. No gavel, no dramatic noise, just a sentence. Then paperwork began moving. For a moment Cullen felt almost nothing. He had imagined relief as something enormous. Instead, it arrived quietly, like a room finally losing a sound you had not realized was bothering you. Lucas caught him in the hallway. Warren and Voss had already gone ahead. Peggy followed several steps behind them. Lucas stood awkwardly with both hands in his jacket pockets. I was wrong. Cullen waited. Lucas looked toward the floor. I kept thinking if Dad gave you money, land, anything valuable, you'd destroy it. You had evidence. Lucas looked up. That's not the part I'm apologizing for. Cullen said nothing. Lucas continued. You did destroy things. Yeah, but I decided that meant you always would. His voice lowered. I made your worst years into your whole future. Cullen felt the sentence land harder because Lucas was not asking for forgiveness afterward. No excuse, no demand, just admission. I'm not ready to make everything okay, Cullen said. I know. Then stop looking at me like I'm still the man you were afraid of. Lucas nodded. I can do that. It was not reconciliation. It was enough for a hallway. Outside, Earl waited beside the truck. Flint saw Cullen first. The German shepherd stood, tail moving once then again. Cullen opened the door. Flint stepped down and pressed against his side. Earl watched. 1. Codicil stands. Earl nodded. Good. They began walking toward Cullen's truck. Halfway there, Earl stopped. There's something I never told you. Cullen looked at him. Earl's pale eyes went toward the courthouse lawn. My boy had a problem. Cullen stayed quiet long time ago. Different drug. Same sort of hole. Earl tightened his hand around the cane. I handled it badly. How? Got angry. Stayed angry. Made rules because rules were easier than being scared. His voice became rougher. When he kept failing, I closed the door. Cullen understood before Earl finished. When I decided maybe I'd closed it too hard, he was already gone far enough I never got him back. I'm sorry. Don't be. You didn't do it. Earl looked toward Flint. Ezra saw all of that. He saw what happened when a father decided a son's worst years were his final shape. Cullen felt the words settle. You think that's why he did all this? Partly. Earl shrugged. Your father was too stubborn to learn every lesson from his own mistakes. Sometimes he borrowed mine. For the first time, Cullen understood why Earl had protected Ezra's instructions with such unreasonable discipline. It had never been only loyalty. It had been penance. You did different with me, Cullen said. Earl stared at him. Not enough to fix the first time. No. Cullen looked toward the courthouse, but enough this time. Earl nodded once. His eyes shone, though he would have blamed the wind if challenged. Renata caught Cullen before he left. One more thing. He turned. The court validated title. I know, that is not a check. Cullen almost smiled. You lawyers really know how to celebrate. The county still needs final appraisal confirmation, title review, easement language, construction terms, and closing. How long? Depends how much groundwork they already completed. Cullen nodded. A year earlier, he would already have spent the money in his head. A truck, a house, a way to prove everyone wrong. Now he looked at Renata and said, "Then we do it in order." She studied him for half a second. Exactly. Cullen walked to his Ford. Flint climbed into the passenger side and turned once before settling. Earl stood beside his own truck. The 11 acres belonged to Cullen. The county project might still bring a large payment, but neither fact felt like the real victory. The real victory was smaller. A legal notice had attacked Ezra's worst years. Cullen had answered without denying them. The court had not needed a perfect father, only a lucid one. And Cullen had not needed to become the man he used to be in order to defend him. He started the engine. For once, winning did not create an urge to run faster. It made him willing to move carefully, one step, then the next. That was enough. The county called Cullen 11 days after the title records were updated. He was standing on a ladder beneath the filling station canopy, replacing a strip of rotted fascia, when his phone vibrated against his hip. The woman from the acquisition office did not congratulate him. Cullen liked her immediately. She explained that the drainage corridor had already been engineered, most of the funding had been approved, and the preliminary appraisal work had been completed months earlier. The title dispute had been the piece holding everything still. Now it was clear. The county wanted to resume negotiations. Cullen climbed down from the ladder before discussing money. That was another new habit. He no longer made important decisions while balancing on unstable things. Over the next 3 weeks, survey lines were checked, easement language revised, temporary construction access defined, and restoration obligations negotiated. The county would not purchase the entire 11 acres. Cullen would keep ownership of the land, but a permanent corridor along Foxglass Creek would become subject to drainage and maintenance rights, while another section would temporarily accommodate construction equipment. The final compensation package came to $341,000. Cullen read the figure 3 times. He had held larger numbers in military briefings. Numbers of miles, numbers of rounds, numbers of people moving through places most Americans would never see. None had ever belonged to him. This one did. That frightened him more than he expected. He called Renata first. "Don't spend it tonight," she said. "I wasn't planning to." That sentence is why I'm less worried than I used to be. Then Cullen called Mara Ellison, one of the counselors from the Veterans Recovery Program outside Duluth. Mara was 49, a medium-height woman with a compact build, warm brown skin, shoulder-length sandy brown hair, usually pulled into a careless ponytail, and dark eyes that could remain kind while refusing to cooperate with self-deception. Cullen remembered her almost always wearing plain cardigans, practical slacks, and running shoes because she hated sitting still during long group sessions. Before becoming a counselor, Mara had spent years working with combat veterans in transitional housing. That experience had stripped away any romantic ideas she might once have had about recovery. She believed boring routines saved more lives than dramatic promises. When Cullen told her the amount, she was silent for several seconds. "That's not a reward," she finally said. "I know. Good. Because money doesn't care whether you're sober." He looked through the office window toward Flint, who was stretched across a patch of winter sunlight near the service bay door. "What do I do with it? Make it boring?" Cullen smiled. "That sounds terrible." "Exactly. Separate accounts, written budget, enough reserve that one bad winter doesn't become an emergency. No proving anything to anybody." She paused. "And sleep on every purchase big enough to impress someone." That last part stayed with him. Renata referred Cullen to Jonah Pike, a 60-year-old independent financial advisor in Duluth. Jonah was tall and lean, with a narrow weathered face, straight nose, gray-green eyes, and close-cropped silver hair. A short silver beard followed his jaw neatly. He wore a brown tweed jacket, blue Oxford shirt, dark trousers, and worn leather loafers that suggested he had stopped dressing to impress clients years earlier. Jonah had spent 3 decades watching sudden inheritances do strange things to ordinary people. His manner was calm, skeptical, and deliberately dull. He asked more questions about Cullen's monthly expenses than about his dreams. Cullen respected him for that. By the end of the week, the money had jobs. A large emergency reserve would remain untouched. Another portion went to operating capital for the station. The roof needed substantial repair. The electrical panel had to be replaced. Structural work around the second bay could no longer be postponed. Both dead fuel pumps had to come out. Insurance had to be re-established. Environmental inspections and tank system certification cost more than Cullen expected. Each number went onto a spreadsheet. Each payment was documented. Once, years earlier, receiving money had made Cullen feel temporarily invincible. Now watching money leave his account for a roof felt strangely reassuring. It meant he was not celebrating. He was building. Earl complained about almost every contractor. Not because they were bad, because they were not Earl. By December, new wiring ran through the building. By early January, the second bay had a properly repaired floor and no hidden compartment beneath it. Cullen stood over the fresh concrete with Flint beside him. No secrets this time. Flint sniffed it once, apparently satisfied. 2 new pumps arrived during a week when snow piled almost knee-deep along County Road 18. Their clean metal looked almost indecent beside the old building until the sign above the office was restored. Cullen could have replaced it. Instead, he paid a local sign painter to reproduce Ezra's original lettering exactly. Hartwell Family Filling Station, same proportions, same border, same slightly old-fashioned shape to the letters, only no peeling paint. Earl stood in the snowy lot the afternoon the restored sign went up. You could have changed the name, I know. Could called it something modern. Like what? Earl considered. Fuel station. Cullen stared at him. That took all morning? I'm 71. Flint sneezed. Cullen looked at the dog. Even he hates it. The station officially reopened 5 months after Warren had first placed the brass key in Cullen's hand. It was a bright January morning, the northern Minnesota sky so clear and cold that sound seemed to travel farther. Snow surrounded the gravel lot in white banks. The 2 new pumps stood beneath the repaired canopy. Warm yellow light shone from the office windows. Earl had agreed to work 3 days a week under the strict condition that nobody describe him as employed. I'm supervising. You're fixing transmissions. Supervising aggressively. Flint acquired his own place beside the office door. A thick rubber mat. A stainless water bowl. Nothing decorative. Within 2 weeks, regular customers began calling him the assistant manager. Earl objected. Assistant manager sleeps 6 hours a shift. Cullen glanced toward Flint, who was lying with his chin on his forelegs. He still gets more done than you. Earl pointed a wrench at him. That sobriety thing made you disrespectful. No, that was pre-existing. The laughter came easier now, not constantly. Cullen did not transform into a cheerful man because his problems improved. But the station no longer felt like a grave with gasoline pumps. People came through the doors. The phone rang. Tools moved. Coffee burned on the warmer. Life made ordinary noise again. Then Noah Brenner appeared. He walked into the first bay one Tuesday morning, holding a folded resume so tightly the edges had gone soft. Noah was 24, about 5 feet 11, with a lean, work-hardened frame and moderate shoulders that had not yet filled out completely. His face was slightly long, with a clean jaw, straight nose, and cautious green-brown eyes. His light brown hair was cut short and practical. A trace of stubble shadowed his chin. He wore a dark gray work shirt over a black t-shirt, dark blue jeans, brown work boots, and carried a pair of work gloves tucked into his rear pocket. The young man had served briefly as an army mechanic before a training accident damaged his shoulder. Prescription pain medication had turned from treatment into dependence before Noah admitted what was happening. He had recently completed a recovery program and was living in a temporary room outside Franklin. The experience had made him careful around authority. He watched people for the moment their faces changed after learning his history. Cullen knew that look. I heard you need help, Noah said. Who told you? Everybody. That narrows it down. Noah handed him the resume. There was a blank period almost a year long. Cullen looked at it, then at him. You know brake systems? Yes, sir. Electrical? Some. Diesel? Army taught me enough to be dangerous. Earl called from beneath a truck. Honest answer. Noah flinched slightly. Cullen noticed. You show up when you say you will? Yes. You tell me when you make a mistake? Yes. Even expensive ones. Noah hesitated. Then, yes. Cullen handed the resume back. Monday. Noah stared at him. You don't want references? I'll call them. The Gap? I can read. Noah waited. Cullen understood what he needed to hear. The Gap isn't the job. Something loosened in Noah's face. Monday? 7:30. He arrived at 7:15. Earl complained. Kids making the rest of us look unreliable. You are unreliable. I'm consistent about it. By spring, the station was stable enough that Cullen allowed himself to consider the idea he had carried quietly since talking to Mara. Not charity. Structure. At Franklin First, Cullen met with Carol and Renata and placed $18.00 into a small assistance fund administered separately from the station's operating money. Cullen refused to put his name on it. Ezra's name too. The fund would provide modest, documented assistance to people coming out of treatment programs, veterans recovery programs, or transitional housing. Not large checks. Practical gaps, gas to reach work, a pair of boots, emergency vehicle repair, a security deposit. Enough money to keep one bad week from becoming the reason someone gave up. Carol asked what he wanted to call it. Cullen thought for a moment. Nothing dramatic. Earl, sitting nearby, said, "The Don't Screw It Up Fund." Carol removed her glasses. No. Cullen almost laughed. Eventually, the paperwork simply referred to it as the North County Transition Fund. Anonymous enough, boring enough. Mara would have approved. Noah became one of its early recipients without knowing who had created it. His temporary housing arrangement ended unexpectedly when the building changed ownership. He found a room closer to the station, but the landlord required a $400 security deposit he did not have. Carol handled the grant. Cullen said nothing. 2 weeks later, small-town mathematics solved the mystery anyway. Noah arrived at the station carrying a folded approval letter. He waited until Earl stepped outside. "This was you." Cullen kept sorting sockets. "What was?" "The deposit." "No." Noah stared up. "Technically, it was the fund. You made the fund. Lots of people make things. You paid for it." Cullen sighed. "You planning to return it?" "I could. Then you didn't need it." Noah's mouth tightened. "That's not what I meant." Cullen set down the socket. Noah looked embarrassed rather than grateful. That interested him. "Why does this bother you?" The young man stared at the concrete. "Because nobody ever gives you something for no reason." Cullen knew that sentence too. He walked into the office and returned with a photocopy of the first transaction page from Ezra's small savings account. Not the balance, just the early deposits, $40, then another month, $50, then $60. Cullen handed Noah the page. "What's this?" "Somebody started putting money away for me when I was a mess." Noah looked at the numbers. "Why?" "He didn't know when I'd need it." Cullen leaned against the counter. "He just figured someday I might need enough room to get through one bad month without making it worse." Noah looked back down. Cullen said, "That $400 isn't supposed to fix your life. It's supposed to make sure the security deposit doesn't get to decide whether you keep fixing it yourself." Noah's eyes reddened slightly. He hated that. Cullen pretended not to notice. "What do I owe you?" "Nothing. That feels wrong." "Good." Noah looked confused. Cullen continued. "Someday, if you're steady and somebody else needs a little room, give them some." "That's it? That's the whole ledger?" Noah folded the paper carefully. After that, he began arriving at 7:10. Earl complained the kid was becoming unbearable. Cullen suspected that was affection. Lucas started appearing on Saturdays. At first, he invented reasons. A box of spare filters the trucking yard no longer needed. A supplier's number. A section of gutter Cullen had already planned to replace. Eventually, he stopped pretending. One cold afternoon, Lucas and Earl spent 2 hours correcting the pitch on the rear gutter while Cullen worked inside. Later, Lucas sat on the tailgate of his pickup. "I've been drinking too much." Cullen did not react. Lucas looked toward the tree line. "Not like you did." Cullen remained silent. Lucas rubbed his hands together. "That sounded bad. Little bit. I mean, I still go to work, so did Dad." Lucas nodded slowly. "That's kind of the problem." Cullen could have told him everything he knew. He could have explained denial, relapse, meetings, withdrawal, treatment. He did not. "You want the address of a Tuesday meeting in Franklin?" Lucas looked at him. "I didn't say I need one. I didn't say you did." A long silence. "Write it down." 3 weeks later, Peggy mentioned that Lucas had started going. Cullen did not congratulate him. He knew better. He simply kept the door unlocked on Saturdays. Warren stayed away through winter, through spring, into early summer. Peggy came occasionally for coffee and never asked Cullen to forgive her husband faster. That helped. Then, one evening, near closing, Warren's pickup entered the gravel lot. Alone. Cullen watched through the office window. Warren remained beside the pumps for almost a minute before walking inside. He looked older, not drastically, just smaller somehow without legal papers in his hands. His eyes moved to an old framed photograph Cullen had hung behind the counter. Ezra in front of the station decades earlier, younger and broad-shouldered, one hand on a fuel pump, grinning at somebody outside the frame. Warren studied it. He looked happy. "I think he was." Warren nodded. "I owe you an apology." Cullen waited. For court, still Cullen said nothing. "I used the worst part of Ezra's life to try to invalidate one of the clearest things he did." Warren looked down at his hands. "I told myself it was fairness." "Was it?" "No." The word came quietly. "I had already counted that parcel into the future." "The truck!" Warren looked up. "You heard that call?" "Yes." Warren gave a tired laugh. "Of course you did." He looked again at Ezra's photograph. I was scared, and when I'm scared, I grab tighter. Cullen understood the trait. He did not excuse it. Warren said, "I'm not asking you to forgive me tonight." "Good." A brief expression crossed Warren's face, almost a smile. Cullen nodded toward the coffee pot. "There's coffee." Warren looked at it. "Your father make that? He's been dead 14 months. Then it might taste better." Cullen poured 2 cups. Warren sat. No reconciliation speech followed. That made the moment more believable. Cullen reached 1 full year sober in late spring, 8 months after returning to Pine Haven. The local recovery group marked the milestone with a small bronze-colored chip. The meeting facilitator was a quiet woman in her early 60s named Diane Mercer, short and sturdy, with cropped silver hair, warm brown eyes, and the patient expression of someone who knew silence was sometimes more useful than encouragement. She wore a blue cardigan and jeans, and never asked people to speak simply because a room had become uncomfortable. She handed Cullen the chip. 1 year. Cullen turned it over in his fingers. It weighed almost nothing. Somehow that seemed right. "What changed?" Diane asked. Cullen considered. "I thought getting sober meant getting my old life back." Several people in the circle watched him. "It doesn't." He looked at the chip. "My old life was part of the problem." A few knowing smiles. "I think recovery is building something new that's strong enough you don't have to keep visiting the old one to prove it happened." He paused. "My dad used to tell me to count carefully." Cullen thought of the acres, the bonds, the little savings account, then Earl, Carol, Lucas, Noah, Flint waiting at home. "I spent a long time counting the wrong things." He closed his fingers around the chip. "That's about all I've got." Diane smiled. "That's enough." That afternoon, Cullen drove to the cemetery with Flint. Spring had fully reached northern Minnesota. Fresh birch leaves trembled bright green along the roadsides, and late sunlight turned them gold at the edges without the season needing to be autumn. Ezra's grave sat beneath an old oak. Cullen stood before the stone. Flint sat beside him. I counted. He did not feel foolish saying it anymore. 11 acres, 61,000, 2,120, 341,000. He looked down at the sobriety chip in his hand. "Pretty sure that wasn't what you meant." Cullen placed a peppermint on the top of the headstone. The station had begun keeping a jar near the register after Peggy mentioned Ezra used to hand them to children whose parents counted gas money in coins. Cullen had not remembered. That was okay. A person did not have to remember every act of kindness for it to have happened. He rested his hand against Flint's neck. "Ready?" The dog stood. They drove home. Evening light filled the Hartwell family filling station when Cullen pulled into the lot. Noah was closing the second bay. Earl was arguing with him about torque specifications. "You don't tighten by emotion," Earl was saying. "I used the spec." "You looked emotionally involved." Noah saw Cullen. "Help." "No." "Coord." "Correct." Flint walked into the second bay. He crossed the repaired concrete, reached the old hydraulic lift, stopped, lowered his nose to the place where the steel box had once been buried. One breath, then another. Cullen watched. Flint straightened, turned away, walked back toward him. Nothing there. No box, no map, no hidden key. For once, the ground did not need to contain another answer. Cullen looked around the station. New pumps outside, Ezra's sign overhead. Earl pretending retirement had been an administrative error. Noah learning a trade instead of apologizing for surviving. Lucas slowly learning that admitting a problem did not create it. Warren somewhere between shame and forgiveness. And Flint standing exactly where he had always been when Cullen needed him most. The steel box had never been the inheritance. It had only been the door. Ezra's real gift had been quieter. 1 bond at a time, $40 at a time. 1 acre protected from the business. 1 signature. 1 promise. 1 stubborn belief that a son who was not ready yet might still become ready someday. Cullen looked through the open bay toward the forest. The light beyond the birches was soft and gold. For most of his life, solid ground had meant something tactical, a position held, a safe route, a place that would bear weight. Now it meant something else, a place where a man could stand without pretending he had never fallen. Flint leaned lightly against Cullen's leg. Cullen rested a hand between his ears. There were no more secrets waiting underneath them. For the first time in years, Cullen did not need one. The ground was enough. Sometimes, the miracle is not that God changes the road in front of us. Sometimes, the miracle is that He gives us enough strength to keep walking until we finally understand why the road was there. Cullen thought he had inherited an old filling station, 11 acres of land, and money his father had hidden away. But in the end, the greatest inheritance was something no bank could hold. It was the knowledge that a person is not defined by the worst chapter of his life. Ezra had failed. Cullen had failed. Earl had failed. Even Warren had allowed fear to lead him somewhere he should never have gone. But failure was not the end of any of their stories. Perhaps that is how grace often works. Not with thunder from the sky. Not always with a sudden answer or an impossible sign. Sometimes God works quietly, through a father saving $40 at a time, through an old friend keeping a promise, through a brother leaving a door open, or through a loyal dog who simply knows when the person beside him needs to stop, breathe, and keep going. In everyday life, we may never discover a hidden box beneath the floor. We may never inherit land or find money waiting in a bank. But each of us may have something just as important waiting to be found. Forgiveness we have been afraid to offer, a second chance we thought we did not deserve, a relationship that can still be repaired, or the courage to take one more honest step forward. So if you are carrying regret today, remember this: God is still working in places you cannot yet see. What looks abandoned may still hold a purpose. What feels broken may still become a foundation. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who may need a little hope today. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from and what this story meant to you. And if you believe stories of loyalty, faith, second chances, and the extraordinary bond between veterans and their K9 companions deserve to be told, please subscribe to K9 Navy SEAL Stories. May God bless you, protect your family, strengthen you through every difficult season, and give you the courage to recognize the quiet miracles He places along your path. And wherever you are tonight, may you always find solid ground beneath your feet,